The Abbey bells tolled softly on a late August morning in 1945 as the war-torn landscape of Europe lay in ruins. In the quiet crypt of Pannonhalma Archabbey in Hungary, the long and difficult life of Princess Stephanie of Belgium reached its end. She was 81 years old, weary, and marked by sorrow and resilience in equal measure. Once a crown princess destined for glory, she was now a widow twice over, estranged from her family, remembered not for triumph, but for tragedy. Hers was a life tied to betrayal, disease, and the weight of dynastic expectations, a life shaped by one moment of horror at a hunting lodge that changed the course of empires. Before we begin her story, may I invite you, wherever you are, to join me in a small ritual. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and at what hour of the day or night. Many of us gather here across time and distance, keeping company in memory and reflection. And if you wish to journey with me again through the lives of the forgotten and the broken, do subscribe. Together we will wander into the darker corridors of history. Let us begin. The year was 1864. Spring in Brussels carried the scent of lilacs into the courtyards of Laeken Palace, where the Belgian royal family resided. On the 21st of May, a princess was born, her name given as Stephanie Clotilde Louise, Hermine Marie Charlotte of Belgium. The palace shone that day with banners and celebration, for she was a child of a rising monarchy. Belgium itself was young, barely 3 decades independent, carving its place on the stage of Europe. Her father was Prince Leopold, heir to the Belgian throne, who would within a short time become King Leopold II. To the public eye, he was a figure of stern dignity, a man whose ambition promised to raise Belgium beyond its modest borders. He built great civic projects, cathedrals of marble and stone, avenues that imitated Paris, all intended to make Brussels into a miniature capital of Europe. Yet the glittering stones were but one face of his reign, for his heart was drawn far beyond the continent to Africa, where he sought wealth and dominion. In her earliest years, the little Stephanie could not have known that much of her comfort, and her splendid palaces would one day be tied to the blood and suffering of the Congo. Millions would toil and perish under the yoke of her father's private rule there. Though in her nursery, surrounded by gilded furniture and governesses, such shadows were invisible. Her mother, Queen Marie Henriette of Austria, brought with her the prestige of the Habsburg dynasty. She was cultured, musical, fond of horses and the countryside, but ill-suited to her husband's temper and ambitions. Their union was political, not affectionate, and the household was marked by distance. In time, the queen would separate herself from court, seeking refuge in her own pursuits while leaving her children in the strict care of tutors and attendants. Stephanie was the third child. Her eldest sister, Louise, had been born in 1858, and their brother, also named Leopold in 1859. He was the pride of the family, the heir to the throne, the hope of continuity. Stephanie's own birth was celebrated, though she would never carry the same weight of expectation as her brother. Another sister, Clementine, would be born some years later. The royal household, though splendid in appearance, was not warm. The children's days were ruled by duty, lessons, and formality. The queen, though caring in her way, was distant, and their father more often concerned with affairs of state than with the intimacy of family life. In such halls, the young Stephanie learned obedience, endurance, and the art of keeping silent. Yet childhood has its moments of brightness. The gardens of Laeken were expansive, filled with rare plants and hothouses, where the little princess might wander under the watchful eyes of nurses. She learned early the languages of Europe, a necessity for royal children, French, German, and in time English. She displayed a lively curiosity, but always checked by discipline, for her tutors believed that indulgence weakened character. But in 1869, when Stephanie was not yet 5, grief entered the household. Her beloved brother, the young Prince Leopold, fell gravely ill and died at the age of 9. His loss shook the family. The king and queen, already distant, grew further apart, and the surviving children felt the cold shadow of mourning settle around them. For Stephanie, the loss left an impression too deep for her tender age. It was said she clutched at her mother's skirts, bewildered, sensing that her own place in the family had shifted in ways she could not understand. The years that followed were troubled. Europe still struggled against waves of epidemic disease. Cholera, typhus, and smallpox crept silently through the cities. In 1871, Brussels was struck, and Stephanie herself was seized with fever. She was only 7 years old when she collapsed into delirium, stricken with typhus. Her small body burned, her eyes fluttered in unconsciousness. For weeks she lingered between life and death, and those in the palace prepared for the worst. But Stephanie survived. Against the odds, her fever broke, and strength returned slowly to her limbs. Yet the experience left her marked. Those who knew her later often spoke of a certain gravity in her, a solemnity rare in children. Perhaps it was the early brush with death, or perhaps the awareness that in royal life, safety and health could never be taken for granted. From that point on, her education was intensified. The tutors, strict and unbending, believed that adversity would forge her character. She was not coddled but pressed to learn music, languages, history, and court etiquette. Her handwriting was corrected until perfect, her posture straightened until it seemed almost rigid. She absorbed it all with quiet determination. By the mid-1870s, her place in the court was changing. Louise, the eldest sister, had married and moved away. Queen Marie Antoinette spent more and more time apart from the capital, preferring the countryside and her horses to the duties of court. In her absence, Stephanie found herself, though still a child, one of the highest-ranking females in the palace. The role brought privilege, but also a weight of expectation that pressed heavily upon her young shoulders. Still, she grew into adolescence surrounded by grandeur. The palace halls, hung with portraits of ancestors, seemed to whisper of destiny. Every gathering of state, every ambassador's visit, reminded her that her future would not be hers to choose. She would one day be matched, like her mother, into a marriage of politics. Such was the fate of royal daughters in Europe. The winter of 1878 would alter the course of her life. She was just 14 when she was introduced to Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and heir to the vast Habsburg Empire. Rudolf was already 20, a man of intellect and charm, but also of turbulence. The match was no accident. Behind the scenes, negotiations had been carefully prepared. For the Austrian court, Stephanie seemed ideal, young, healthy, Catholic, and capable of bearing heirs. At that winter gathering under chandeliers and the rustle of silk gowns, her eyes met his. She could not have known then how profoundly this meeting would seal her fate, and how much pain it would bring. The music of the ball faded, but the sound of her name lingered in Rudolph's mind, just as his troubled gaze lingered in hers. The story of Stephanie of Belgium was now forever entwined with the destiny of Austria. And as the orchestra played on, somewhere in the distance, a candle flickered, trembling before it was consumed. The candlelight that trembled in the ballroom fades into another light, a duller one. The glow of funeral torches carried through the streets of Brussels in the chill of January 1869. Their flames swayed in the winter wind, and the muffled sound of mourning drums echoed across the palace courtyards. Stephanie was only 4.5 years old when her world shifted again. Her brother, the little Prince Leopold, the hope of the Belgian crown, lay lifeless in his coffin. The court had dressed him in finery, a pale wreath placed upon his small brow. Bells tolled for the boy who would never reign, and a nation mourned for its heir. For a child like Stephanie, the meaning of death was not yet clear, but the mood of the household pressed down upon her with an inexorable weight. She clutched at her mother's skirts, bewildered, unable to understand why the warmth of her brother's laughter had suddenly gone, why his toys lay abandoned, why the palace halls echoed with whispers instead of play. The loss marked her parents, too. King Leopold, though stern, had invested his hopes in the boy. Queen Marie Henriette, already weary of her husband's coldness, found her grief deepening the gulf between them. Where once there had been some effort at unity, now there was only distance. The marriage, arranged and loveless, cracked under the strain of mourning. In the great chambers of Laeken, grief and silence became companions. Little Stephanie wandered through rooms that seemed far too vast for her small figure. Portraits of ancestors gazed down at her with stern expressions, and she felt, in her child's way, the sense that her family's destiny was both heavy and uncertain. 2 years later, death crept close to her again. Europe still wrestled with waves of epidemic disease. Typhus, smallpox, and cholera moved invisibly through cities, carried on water, breath, and touch. In 1871, when Stephanie was 6, Brussels was struck by an outbreak. The palace walls, high and guarded, were no true defense against contagion. Soon the young princess herself fell ill. The fever gripped her suddenly. One day she was in her nursery playing with her dolls. The next she was confined to her bed, her body burning. The illness brought delirium. She drifted in and out of consciousness, eyes glazed, lips murmuring incoherent words. Her family watched in fear. Servants hovered. Doctors came and went, each bringing little comfort. Typhus was merciless. For weeks her life hung in the balance. The child who had seemed so full of promise lay motionless, sweat-drenched sheets clinging to her frail form. Courtiers whispered in corridors that Belgium might lose yet another child of the crown. For a time, it seemed certain. But one day, almost as mysteriously as it had begun, the fever broke. The sharp intensity of illness eased into exhaustion, and Stephanie's breathing steadied. Slowly, she recovered, though the ordeal left its mark. Surviving such an illness was a kind of rebirth, but it gave her a new gravity. No longer merely the innocent child of palace nurseries, she carried with her the silent knowledge that life was fragile, even for a princess. As she grew stronger, her education resumed. Her parents, especially her mother, placed great emphasis on discipline. Stephanie's governesses and tutors were strict, believing that indulgence weakened character. Her lessons were long, demanding, and unrelenting. She studied languages, history, music, and etiquette. French was spoken at court, German connected her to her mother's homeland, and English was taught for diplomacy. Every mistake in her handwriting was corrected until perfection. Every misstep and posture straightened. She was not coddled, but forged. There were moments of play, but they were overshadowed by duty. She learned to curtsy correctly before portraits of long-dead rulers, to stand still while adults debated her future. She was told stories of her grandfather, Leopold I, who had shaped Belgium from its birth as an independent kingdom in 1831. These tales reminded her that she belonged not merely to a family, but to a dynasty, and dynasties were bound by responsibility rather than affection. By the mid-1870s, her position within the family altered again. Louise, her elder sister, had married and departed from Brussels. Queen Marie Henriette spent long stretches of time away from court, preferring the countryside and her beloved horses. With her mother absent and her sister gone, Stephanie, though still a child, found herself as the highest-ranking female royal at court. She was not yet ready for such a role, yet circumstance thrust it upon her. In the echoing corridors of the palace, she felt the emptiness keenly. At ceremonies and receptions, she was called upon to stand beside her father, smiling and nodding as if she understood the weighty discussions of statesmen and diplomats. Courtiers observed her closely. They saw in her a girl of composure, obedient and intelligent, yet reserved. The grief of her early years and the illness that had nearly claimed her had carved away the softness of childhood. The rigid rhythm of her days continued. Lessons, ceremonies, meals taken in silence, endless instructions on how to behave as one destined for a role beyond herself. The warmth of family affection was absent. Her father was stern, her mother distant, her sisters away. She carried her loneliness inward, learning not to expect consolation. It was perhaps a preparation for the life that awaited her. And then, in the winter of 1878, a new thread appeared in her destiny. Snow lay heavy upon Brussels, muffling the city in white. Within the palace, however, the air was alive with expectation. Diplomats whispered, plans were set in motion. For the empire to the east, Austria-Hungary was seeking a bride for its young heir, Crown Prince Rudolf. She was 14 when she met him. The palace that winter glittered with chandeliers, music, and the rustle of gowns. Stephanie stood among the courtiers, her youth plain to see, her dark eyes solemn. Across the ballroom stood Rudolf, already 20, a man whose name was spoken with a mixture of admiration and unease. He was brilliant, quick-minded, but restless, known to defy the strictures of his father, Emperor Franz Joseph. Their meeting was no chance encounter. Negotiations had been long underway, and the Austrian court saw in Stephanie the perfect candidate. Catholic, young, of respectable lineage, and capable of strengthening ties between the two monarchies. She, of course, had no say. For her, it was another duty. She curtsied as she had been taught, and raised her eyes to his. He bowed as form required. It was a moment that seemed ordinary, yet within it lay the weight of fate. Her tutors had prepared her for ceremony, for obedience, but not for the turmoil that this man would bring into her life. At 14, she could not know that she had been chosen not for herself, but for what she could represent, for the heirs she was expected to bear. As the music swelled and couples moved across the ballroom floor, she stood still, her hands folded, her future already being written in whispers and contracts. Rudolph's gaze lingered on her, as though measuring her worth, and she, shy and solemn, felt both curiosity and unease. The evening ended as all such gatherings did, with polite farewells and the fading of music into the night. But for Stephanie, the memory of Rudolph's face would remain. She had seen in his eyes not only charm, but also something troubled, something restless that hinted at storms to come. The ball was over, but her life had been set upon a new path, and in a chamber lit by a single candle, the flame wavered once more, bending in the draught, uncertain whether to endure or to vanish. The candlelight wavers, and with it comes the shifting glow of many candles, their flames mirrored in the polished marble of Vienna's grand halls. The year is 1881, and the Austrian capital prepares for a royal wedding that will bind together two dynasties, the young Belgian princess and the troubled heir to the Habsburg throne. The sound of carriages rattles through narrow streets, their wheels echoing against stone walls, while within palaces, seamstresses, jewelers, and courtiers labor to prepare for the spectacle. Stephanie was not yet 17 when her engagement to Rudolf was formally announced. She had grown from the solemn child who had survived fever into a young woman whose future had been decided for her. Behind the negotiations lay politics more than affection. The Habsburg Empire, vast and multi-ethnic, stretching across Central Europe, required stability. The heir, Crown Prince Rudolf, was expected to marry well and to secure the succession with children. Stephanie's youth, her Catholic upbringing, and her respectable lineage as daughter of the Belgian king made her suitable. Suitability, in the language of dynasties, was enough. And so, in May of that year, just days before her 17th birthday, Stephanie entered Vienna to marry Rudolf. The city greeted her with fanfare. Church bells rang, processions wound through streets decorated with flags and flowers. Citizens craned their necks to glimpse the young bride, who would one day, it was hoped, be empress. The ceremony itself was held in the Augustinian Church, a place that had witnessed generations of Habsburg marriages. The church was resplendent, its altars heavy with gold, its arches filled with music. Stephanie stood in her gown, white and shimmering, a diamond tiara catching the light. Her dark hair was arranged with precision, her posture perfect, as years of discipline had taught her. At her side stood Rudolph, 23, tall and elegant, his uniform glittering with medals. To the crowd, they seemed the picture of a royal union. Yet appearances can be deceiving. The marriage was not born of love, but of arrangement. Those who watched may have sensed nothing amiss, yet beneath the surface lay tensions. Rudolph, intelligent and charming, was also restless and melancholic, often at odds with his father. Stephanie, dutiful and obedient, entered the union with hope, perhaps, but little power. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and the choir's voices rose in triumph. The empire had its princess, and Belgium had placed its daughter upon one of Europe's most glittering thrones. But even then, in the midst of splendor, the first shadows of disquiet were near. Life within the Habsburg court was rigid, its rituals unyielding. The Hofburg Palace, with its endless corridors and ceremonious routines, became Stephanie's new world. She was watched constantly, her movements guided, her days filled with obligation. At first, she and Rudolph were cordial. There were moments of laughter, shared rides, and the gentle beginnings of companionship. But affection, deep and enduring, did not blossom. Rudolph's temperament was volatile. He longed for freedom, for intellectual conversation, for causes that often clashed with the conservative court. He read widely, debated fiercely, and sought solace in circles outside the palace walls. Stephanie, trained to obedience and ceremony, struggled to understand him. She played her part, but she felt the distance grow. Still, there were moments when the marriage seemed promising. In September 1883, Stephanie gave birth to their only child, a daughter, Elizabeth Marie. The court celebrated, though quietly, for what was desired was not a daughter, but a son. Rudolph, polite in public, could not hide his disappointment. The weight of dynastic expectation pressed heavier upon Stephanie, though through no fault of her own. She was young, she was healthy, and she had fulfilled her duty. Yet whispers grew when no further children came. Doctors were summoned, examinations conducted. At first, they spoke of peritonitis, of some mysterious ailment that had left her unable to conceive again. Only later, in hushed tones, did the truth emerge. Rudolph, whose life was marked not only by alcohol and despair, but also by indulgence in affairs, had contracted illnesses he passed on to his wife. Syphilis, gonorrhea, diseases rarely spoken of aloud in royal chambers, were part of their hidden reality. Stephanie, still in her early 20s, was left infertile. The role for which she had been chosen to provide heirs was thus denied her. It was a cruel betrayal. She, the obedient daughter and faithful wife, was now marked by what her husband's recklessness had done. At the time, medicine could not cure such afflictions. They lingered, devastating, stigmatized, whispered about. For Stephanie, the knowledge came slowly, pieced together from what doctors implied and from what Rudolph's behavior made plain. By 22, she knew she would never bear another child. Resentment grew. She withdrew from Rudolph's bed, repelled by his debauchery, wounded by his betrayal. He, in turn, drifted further into despair, into drink, into the company of other women. Their marriage became one of cold civility, broken only by arguments and long silences. The grand halls of Vienna, once meant to be her stage, felt like a prison. Her in-laws, especially the Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi, treated her coolly, preferring to keep distance. Stephanie was isolated, confined in a world that had little sympathy for her plight. She remained crown princess, but her role was diminished. As the years passed, the court gossiped openly. It was known that no more children would come. It was known, too, that Rudolph's behavior was erratic, his health failing. The young Belgian princess, who had once been welcomed with celebration, now seemed a silent, unwanted presence in the palace. And yet life continued in its ceremonial rhythm. Balls were held, banquets given, foreign dignitaries received. Stephanie attended, dressed with precision, face composed, her inner turmoil hidden. She was admired for her dignity, though those who looked closer saw in her eyes the weariness of disappointment. But the shadows deepened. Among Rudolph's many affairs, one would prove catastrophic. A young baroness, barely 17, became his constant companion. Their secret meetings, their reckless passion, set the stage for a tragedy that would echo through Europe. In the quiet of the Hofburg, Stephanie sat at her desk, a letter lying unopened before her. She had not yet read the words that would soon shatter her world, but she felt the unease in the air, the storm gathering beyond her control. The letter waited, silent and ominous, its sealed wax unbroken, as the empire itself trembled on the brink of scandal. The letter lay still upon the desk, its seal unbroken, the wax catching faint glimmers of light from a nearby lamp. Stephanie hesitated before it, though she already knew what it must contain. News of her husband's wanderings reached her in fragments, carried by whispers in the palace corridors, murmured by servants, or written into careful reports by those whose duty it was to observe. Each letter bore the same unspoken message. Crown Prince Rudolph had again lost himself in distractions, in pleasures, in company far from the duties of his rank. She unfolded it at last. The lines, polite in tone, concealed scandal beneath restraint. A name was mentioned, one that she had already heard among the hushed conversations of Vienna society. Baroness Mary Wetzera. 17 years old, radiant, impressionable, drawn into the dangerous orbit of a man twice her age, a man who, though crown prince, was already sliding into despair. For Stephanie, the words on the page confirmed what her heart had already understood. Her marriage was not simply loveless, it was doomed. She had long since retreated from Rudolph's presence, her resentment sharpened by betrayal, her health altered by the disease he had given her. Now she knew another woman occupied the place she could not fill, not in the eyes of the court, nor in the expectations of empire. Rudolph and Mary withdrew often to a hunting lodge at Mayerling, a secluded retreat amid wooded hills not far from Vienna. The place, once built for leisure, became their refuge from scrutiny. It was said that Rudolph filled its rooms with mementos, trappings of escape, a small kingdom where he might imagine freedom from the weight of crown and family. For Mary, it was romance, adventure, and perhaps the illusion of love that would endure beyond convention. For Stephanie, it was a wound she could not heal, a symbol of all she had lost. The years leading to 1889 were uneasy. Rudolph's behavior grew erratic, shaped perhaps by illness, by drink, by inner turmoil. He clashed with his father, Emperor Franz Joseph, on matters of politics, on matters of morality. He found no solace in the rigid world of the court, nor in the marriage that had long since fractured. His only child was a daughter, Elizabeth Marie, and in the conservative eyes of the dynasty, this was a failure. The empire demanded a male heir, and none would come from Stephanie. On the evening of the 29th of January, 1889, Rudolph traveled again to Mayerling. Mary Wetzera accompanied him. The details of that night remain shrouded in mystery, blurred by rumor and silence, but the conclusion was terrible. By morning, both were dead. The news struck Vienna like thunder. Servants discovered their bodies in a locked chamber. The young baroness, lifeless. The crown prince, self-inflicted wounds upon him, a pistol nearby. Panic spread through the household, through the palace, through the empire itself. 1,000 questions arose at once. Had it been a double suicide? A pact of lovers? Was there conspiracy, assassination, political intrigue? Was Rudolph driven by illness, by despair, by madness? The court hastened to conceal what it could. Rumors spread regardless. For years, speculation would not cease. But the fact was unalterable. The heir to the Habsburg throne lay dead, his mistress beside him, their story ending in violence at Mayerling. When the news reached Stephanie, she was 24 years old. Widowhood fell upon her abruptly, without warning, without preparation. She had lived for years in disappointment, in betrayal. But this was final. Her husband, for all his faults, was gone. Her marriage, already hollow, was ended by tragedy that would forever be tied to her name. In the letter he had left for her, Rudolph wrote with a strange, subdued affection, though it could not undo the damage of years. The words, tender in places, could not erase the infections he had given her, the humiliation of his affairs, the coldness of their union. Nor could they shield her from what would follow: isolation, rejection, and the enduring shadow of Mayerling. Her place in Vienna grew unbearable. The court, uneasy with her presence, turned its back. To them, she was a reminder of scandal, of death, of dynastic failure. She remained tied to the empire through her daughter, who could not be taken from the Habsburg household. But she herself, the foreign princess, seemed out of place, unneeded, a widow of little influence. She sought to return to Belgium, to her family, to her homeland. But permission was denied. The court insisted that Elizabeth Marie must remain in Austria, raised as a Habsburg, a future pawn in dynastic plans. Stephanie could not remove her child, and so she stayed, caught between longing for home and the cage of Vienna. The grief was compounded by solitude. She had no allies within the imperial family. The Empress Elizabeth, though herself an outsider in many ways, gave her no comfort. Emperor Franz Joseph treated her with formality, nothing more. The salons of Vienna whispered about her, sometimes with pity, more often with cold disdain. She was still young, still graceful, but her future seemed closed. In those months of mourning, she sought companionship in one who had shown her kindness during the ordeal. Count Artur Potocki, a Polish nobleman, became her confidant, her solace. Their bond grew tender, and for a time she tasted something close to love, unshaped by politics, unburdened by dynastic duty. He stood by her quietly through gossip, through isolation, through the grief that still hung heavy upon her. Yet even this brief light was taken from her. Potocki fell ill with cancer of the larynx, a cruel affliction that robbed him of his voice. Doctors attempted surgery, but it failed, leaving him mute, his strength diminished. By March of 1890, he was dead. Stephanie, still grieving the violent end of her husband, was plunged again into mourning. Within a single year, she had lost both the man who betrayed her and the man who had comforted her. To escape the sorrow, she began to travel. Across the Mediterranean, she drifted, Malta, Sicily, Tunisia, Corfu, seeking distraction, or perhaps seeking a place where the weight of Mayerling could not follow. But grief, like shadow, traveled with her. Wherever she went, it lingered. And still, the image of the hunting lodge remained in her mind. Mayerling, its shuttered windows, its silent rooms, the gunshot echoing in memory. That single night had severed her life into before and after. It was a wound time could not close, a whisper that would follow her even decades later when she would write her memoirs. But for now, she was a widow in her mid-20s, isolated, adrift, bound by court yet unwanted by it. The empire carried on with its ceremonies, but behind the glitter, Stephanie lived in silence. And as she traveled, as she drifted across seas and through foreign cities, The echo of that single gunshot seemed to follow her, faint yet insistent, as though it had been fired not only in a lodge at Mayerling, but into the course of her life itself. The sound lingered, and in its silence another image rose. Falling rain upon a fresh grave, water pooling upon stone, as if the heavens themselves mourned with her. The rain drummed steadily on the stone, tracing dark rivulets down the polished surface of Count Potocki's grave. Drops gathered on the edges, slid into the carved letters, and fell to the earth below. Stephanie stood there for the last time, a widow still wrapped in mourning black, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The rain soaked into her veil, into her shoes, and yet she did not move, for there was nowhere else she belonged. But life, even when unwelcome, pulls forward. The months after his death became a season of drifting. She traveled across the Mediterranean, boarding steamships that carried her away from Vienna's watchful eyes. Malta, with its fortresses against the sea, Sicily with its volcanic slopes and orange groves, Tunisia, bright with whitewashed walls and sunlit courtyards, Corfu, whose olive trees rustled gently in the wind. At each stop she sought distraction, a pause from the heavy weight of memory. Yet grief clung to her as the rain had clung to her clothing that day by the grave. The newspapers followed her movements, speculating endlessly. Would the young crown princess, widowed and alone, be remarried into another court? Monarchies were careful with such matters. A widow of high birth was both an opportunity and a problem. For her father, King Leopold II, the issue was particularly pressing. He was aging, his health uncertain, and his dynasty fragile. He had daughters, but no surviving son. He looked upon Stephanie as a piece to be moved once more on the board of dynastic politics. His hope, and even his demand, was clear. She must marry again and not beneath her station. For Leopold, marriage was duty, never affection. He sought a match with the new heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Such a union, he believed, would heal the scandal of Mayerling and restore his daughter to the highest rank. But life is not so neatly arranged. Franz Ferdinand had his own will and his own secret attachments. The proposed union never materialized. Meanwhile, Stephanie lingered in the strange half-light of widowhood. She was neither a reigning figure nor entirely dismissed, neither fully at home in Vienna nor welcomed back in Brussels. Her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, remained at the Habsburg court. The little girl grew quickly, watched over by imperial attendants, shaped into a princess of Austria rather than Belgium. For Stephanie, the distance was painful, yet she had little power to resist. She saw her daughter often enough to keep the bond alive, but always under the shadow of others' control. By the late 1890s, her path took a turn. In her travels and social circles, she encountered Count Elimer Longnier, a Hungarian aristocrat. He was not the heir of an empire, not a prince of royal blood, but a man of good standing, respected, educated, and kind. He admired Stephanie for herself, not for her rank, not for the titles she carried. Their bond deepened, and what began as companionship grew into affection, and then into love. It was a quiet love, without the fanfare of dynastic matchmakers. It was born of mutual respect, of shared moments, of the solace that two wounded hearts can give one another. Elimer was Protestant by faith, but he converted to Catholicism, hoping to win the approval of King Leopold. The king, however, was unmoved. To him, Count Longnier was far beneath his daughter's station. The thought of a Belgian princess marrying into the Hungarian nobility, leaving behind her imperial titles, was intolerable. He wrote to her with cold severity, forbidding the match, warning her of disgrace. But Stephanie had lived enough years under the rule of others. She had endured disease, betrayal, widowhood, and loss. At last, she made her own choice. In defiance of her father, she married Elemer on the 22nd of March, 1900, at Miramar Castle near Trieste. The ceremony was smaller, less ostentatious than her wedding to Rudolf, but it was hers. For the first time, she felt she had chosen her path, not had it chosen for her. The price, however, was high. By marrying beneath her rank, she forfeited her imperial titles. No longer crown princess, no longer addressed as a future empress, she became simply Countess Launier. Her father raged, severing ties with her. He forbade her to attend her mother's funeral in 1902. He refused to see her again, even in his final years. The rift was permanent and it was bitter, yet Stephanie accepted it. In Elemer, she found a partner who valued her as a woman rather than as a dynastic token. They built their life together with quiet dignity, despite the disdain of courts and the fury of kings. Their union was not grand, not celebrated, but it was real. In this love, she found something she had never known in Vienna, never known even in her childhood home: affection untainted by calculation. Meanwhile, across Europe, her father's reign grew darker. Leopold II expanded his personal rule in the Congo, transforming it into a vast private possession. There, under his name, atrocities were committed on a scale that shocked the world. Forced labor, mutilations, villages destroyed, millions of lives lost. The wealth that flowed into Belgium, the grand buildings he raised in Brussels, came at this terrible cost. Stephanie could not escape the knowledge that her father's riches, and thus her own comforts in youth, were tied to suffering far away. The stain of it followed the family. When Leopold died in 1909, he left behind not only this dark legacy, but also immense wealth. His daughters expected inheritance. Instead, they found themselves disinherited. Most of his fortune was left to Caroline Lacroix, his much younger mistress, whom he had secretly married just days before his death. Outraged, Stephanie and her sisters launched legal battles. Courts filled with arguments, documents were scrutinized, and newspapers published scandal after scandal. After years of wrangling, Stephanie secured a settlement of several million francs, a victory of sorts, though bitter in taste. By then, she and Elemer had settled at Rusovce, near Bratislava, in what is now Slovakia. The estate became their refuge, their home away from the great capitals. The gardens spread wide, the house stood quiet, and for the first time, Stephanie lived without the rigid confines of dynastic duty. She was not empress, not crown princess, not pawn of kings. She was a wife, a mistress of a household, a woman who had carved a space of her own. In the evenings, when twilight fell upon Rusovsk, she would walk slowly among the trees, listening to the quiet sounds of the countryside. The palace halls of Vienna were behind her, the bitterness of Brussels too far to disturb her. And though memories of Meyerling never fully left, here they softened, blurred by the gentleness of daily life. Still, history does not release its hold so easily. Storms gathered across Europe again. The heir once proposed for her hand, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, would soon step into his fateful role. And from the streets of Sarajevo, a gunshot would echo that would not only kill him, but also plunge Europe into war. But for now, Stephanie walked beneath the trees of Rusovce, the sound of leaves in the wind surrounding her, as if the earth itself offered her a rare moment of peace. The wind stirred stronger, bending branches, carrying with it a sound faint at first, then louder, the distant tolling of bells, the bells of Sarajevo in June 1914, calling the city to witness an assassination that would ignite the world. The bells of Sarajevo tolled through the warm air of June 1914, their peals mingling with the shouts of crowds in the street. Gunshots had already cracked across the morning, echoing against the stone facades. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, lay bleeding in the arms of his wife, Sophie. The shots of Gavrilo Princip had found their mark, and in their echo, the fragile balance of Europe collapsed. News of the assassination reached Vienna in hours, and from there it traveled swiftly across borders. For Princess Stephanie, now Countess Launier, the news was heavy with irony. Years earlier, her father had once dreamed she might wed Franz Ferdinand, sealing her place as future empress. That path had been denied, and now the man himself was dead, his life cut short by a bullet on a city street. But the implications were far wider. The death of the heir was not only a personal tragedy for the Habsburg family, it was a spark thrown into a continent filled with dry tinder. Within weeks, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Alliances formed, threats were answered with threats, and soon Europe descended into war. For Stephanie, the war years brought a new kind of exile. She was Belgian by birth, Austrian by marriage, and Hungarian by choice of home. When Germany invaded Belgium in August 1914, despite its declared neutrality, her homeland was overrun. The suffering of her people filled the newspapers of the world. Villages burned, civilians fled, refugees poured into France, Britain, and the Netherlands. To be a Belgian in that moment was to bear witness to tragedy. Yet in Austria-Hungary, where she resided, Belgium was seen as the enemy, aligned with the Allied powers against the Central ones. She felt the sharp contradiction of her identity. Her heart was tied to her homeland, yet her life was bound within the empire that now fought against it. Conversations became cautious, her loyalties questioned. Some whispered that she could not be trusted. Others simply avoided her, unwilling to confront the awkwardness of her position. At Rusovci, she and Elimir withdrew into quiet life. The estate, distant from front lines, spared them the devastation that ravaged so much of Europe. Yet the war intruded in subtler ways. Supplies grew scarce, news from the front was grim, and neighbors whispered of sons lost in Galicia, of fields left untended, of hunger. The war seemed to seep into the soil itself. Stephanie did what she could. Like many women of her rank, she turned to charitable work. She organized aid for local families, supported hospitals, and offered assistance to those displaced by conflict. In these efforts, she found a purpose, a way to channel her energy into something beyond memory and regret. But even this was tinged with unease. To aid Hungarians was to serve the empire that fought against Belgium. To withhold was to deny her duty to the place she now called home. There was no easy resolution, only the quiet work of compassion, done with discretion. Meanwhile, her estrangement from her daughter deepened. Elizabeth Marie, now grown, was restless and rebellious. Known to the public as the Red Archduchess, she embraced socialism, moving in circles that scandalized the court. Mother and daughter clashed bitterly. Stephanie, molded by discipline and royal restraint, could not accept Elizabeth's defiance, her rejection of aristocratic values. The war years only widened the gulf. Letters between them grew fewer, conversations more strained. By the early 1920s, they would cease altogether, their bond broken beyond repair. The war dragged on year after year. Europe's fields became wastelands of mud and wire. Millions fell. Empires groaned under the weight of loss. By 1916, when Emperor Franz Joseph died, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy itself trembled. A new ruler, Charles the Third, attempted reforms, even floated the idea of peace, but the momentum of destruction was too great. In Vienna, Stephanie and Elimir returned briefly for the emperor's funeral and Charles's coronation. For a moment, the old grandeur flared again. Black draped across the Hofburg, solemn music filling St. Stephen's Cathedral. Crowds gathered in mourning and hope. Stephanie walked among them, older now, her face lined by grief and time. Her place at court diminished, but not erased. She watched as Charles and his wife Zita were crowned, symbols of a dynasty in decline. 2 months later, Elimir was granted the title of prince within the Hungarian aristocracy. It was a mark of favor, a recognition of service, and it pleased Stephanie to see her husband honored. But it could not disguise the truth. The empire itself was dying. In 1918, the war ended in catastrophe for Austria-Hungary. The empire fractured into nations: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. Monarchs fled, titles evaporated, the old order crumbled. For the Habsburgs, exile was swift and permanent. For Stephanie, however, there was no forced departure. She and Elimir remained at Rusovce, their estate now part of the newly formed Czechoslovakia. The world had shifted beneath their feet, yet their home still stood, their life preserved. The collapse of empires was a strange liberation. No longer tethered to the rigid hierarchy of Vienna, Stephanie lived more freely, though her titles carried little weight. She was now simply a woman of means, a noblewoman in a new republic, her past lingering like a shadow. She filled her days with travel, with reading, with charitable projects. She was seen in society, though never central to it. The scandal of Mayerling had faded in public memory, but for her it never disappeared. As the 1920s advanced, her solitude deepened. She had Elimir, steadfast and devoted, but her relationship with her daughter was gone. Elizabeth Marie's embrace of socialism, her turbulent personal life, her rejection of aristocratic tradition, all estranged her from her mother. In 1924, after a final quarrel, they parted completely. They would never speak again. This silence, perhaps more than widowhood, perhaps even more than exile, weighed on Stephanie. She had survived illness, betrayal, scandal. But the estrangement from her only child was a wound that never healed. She buried it beneath composure, as she had buried so many sorrows. Yet in private, she felt its ache. By the early 1930s, her thoughts turned increasingly to memory. She began to write, shaping her life into a narrative that the world might read. The book she produced was not a full account. It was selective, shaped carefully. Published in 1935 and in English 2 years later under the title I Should Have Been Empress, it focused on her early years, her marriage, and the tragedy of Mayerling. The decades that followed were largely omitted, as if her story had ended in 1889. Perhaps that was the truth of her memory. Perhaps in her heart her life had been defined by that single night when her husband and his young mistress lay dead in Mayerling. Everything afterward was an echo, a shadow, a continuation without center. Her memoir carried her voice into the world once more, but it also revealed her silence. The chapters after 1889 remained unwritten, blank pages where she had chosen not to look, and so she lived quietly at Rusovce, a princess who had once stood at the center of dynastic ambition, now a woman who walked slowly in her gardens, listening to the rustle of leaves, reflecting on what might have been. As dusk fell one evening, she closed her manuscript, the final page left bare, a silence more eloquent than words. The room darkened, the air grew still, and outside the steady ticking of a clock measured time's relentless passage, each stroke carrying her closer to the shadows of history. The ticking did not stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it blended with another sound, the march of boots upon stone, the rise of voices in unison, the herald of a new storm gathering across Europe. The ticking of the clock grew heavier, louder, until it merged with another rhythm, the sound of boots striking pavement, thousands moving in step. The 1930s had arrived, and across Europe a new tide was rising. Voices shouted in unison, flags unfurled, and in the great cities, crowds gathered to cheer men who promised strength after years of hardship. Fascism spread like a shadow, creeping into every corner, filling squares with banners and echoes. Stephanie, now in her 7th decade, watched these changes with weary eyes. From Rusovce, she read the newspapers, heard the reports, and felt the unease that swept through Central Europe. The collapse of Austria-Hungary after the Great War had shattered old certainties, but the peace that followed was fragile. Germany seethed with resentment. Italy marched under Mussolini, and in her adopted land, Hungary, currents of nationalism and discontent swirled. She had lived long enough to recognize the signs. She had seen how ambition, unchecked, could lead to ruin. She remembered her father's relentless drive for empire in Africa, his quest for wealth at any cost. She remembered her husband Rudolf, consumed by inner demons, undone by pressures he could not master. Now she watched as entire nations moved with similar restless energy, driven by anger, fear, and the longing for power. At Rusovci, life remained outwardly calm. The estate, with its wide gardens and fields, seemed far removed from the fever of politics. Elemer tended to the affairs of the household, managed lands, received guests. They still traveled, though less frequently, visiting friends, attending small gatherings, keeping ties with what remained of aristocratic circles. Yet beneath the surface, the world was shifting. Conversations at dinners turned uneasy, glances grew guarded. Even in drawing rooms, politics crept in, unavoidable. Stephanie's memoir had been published by this time, carrying her voice into the public once more. Readers, curious about the widow of Mayerling, purchased the book, hoping for revelations. What they found instead was a selective account, a careful shaping of her life. She had ended the story with Rudolf's death, leaving the decades since in shadow. Critics remarked upon the omissions, but the public seemed satisfied with the glimpse into the tragedy that had haunted Europe's imagination for half a century. For Stephanie, the memoir was both release and concealment. It allowed her to fix her story in a way she could control, yet it also reminded her of how much she had chosen not to reveal. The estrangement from her daughter, the bitterness of inheritance disputes, the quiet life at Rusovcha. These remained unspoken, left to silence. She had offered the world the part of her life she believed they wished to see, and she withheld the rest. As the decade advanced, silence became harder to keep. Storm clouds gathered once more. Germany, under Hitler, began to expand. Austria was annexed in 1938, its independence swallowed into the Reich. Czechoslovakia, too, was threatened, its borders redrawn. Rusovca, lying within Slovak territory, suddenly stood in a region fraught with uncertainty. For Stephanie and Elemer, the war drums grew louder not from afar, but from the very edges of their land. Old age brought its own frailties. Stephanie, once the young bride of Vienna, was now an elderly woman, her hair silvered, her movements slower. She walked still in her gardens, though with measured steps, pausing often to rest, leaning on her husband's arm. She had outlived so many: her parents, her sisters, her husband Rudolf, her lover Potocki, her father's mistresses, even many of the monarchs she had once known. Yet she felt no triumph in survival. Life had been long, but it had not been easy. The estrangement from her daughter remained unresolved. Elizabeth Marie, fiery and outspoken, embraced political movements that clashed with her mother's beliefs. Their quarrels had ended in silence, and silence endured. Stephanie spoke of her rarely, as if by refusing to name her, she could lessen the pain. But in private moments, when the house was still, she must have thought of her grandchildren, growing up at a distance she could never cross. By 1939, the clock struck louder. Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began. Europe once more descended into fire. Though Rusovci was not at first a battlefield, the war pressed closer each year. Supplies dwindled, soldiers passed along roads, refugees drifted across borders. Plans were drawn by occupying forces to seize estates, to use them for military purposes. Even the quiet refuge of Rusovce was not beyond reach. Stephanie and Elemer endured with patience. They retreated further into private life, avoiding entanglements, conserving what they could. The war years were marked not by grand events in their household, but by waiting, by watching, by enduring. For Stephanie, it was a final test of resilience. She had lived through the collapse of dynasties, the fall of empires, the eruption of one great war. Now she witnessed another, greater still, and she bore it with the same reserve that had shaped her all her life. Still, anxiety grew. As the Red Army advanced westward, the danger became real. Reports reached them that the Nazis intended to convert Rusovchi into a field hospital. The Soviets, when they came, would bring their own demands. Nowhere was safe, and the old world of aristocratic estates seemed destined to vanish. Stephanie, aged and tired, sought refuge in faith. She and Elémère turned to the church, to prayer, to the monasteries that offered shelter. In those cloisters, with their stone walls and echoing chants, she felt a calm she had not known since childhood. The abbey bells that had tolled at her youth, at weddings, at funerals, tolled again, steady in their rhythm, as if indifferent to the rise and fall of empires. Yet even in those sacred halls, uncertainty followed. War respected no walls, and the abbeys themselves were not beyond danger. Still, Stephanie lingered in their quiet, her mind drifting backward as much as forward. She remembered Laeken, her childhood palace. She remembered Vienna, the ballrooms, the grandeur, the suffocating duty. She remembered Mayerling, its silence broken by a gunshot that never stopped echoing in her memory. And she remembered Rusovce, the home she had made in defiance, where love had finally softened her life. In the gathering darkness of war, these memories blurred together, forming a tapestry of sorrow and endurance. Her body weakened, but her mind clung to the fragments that defined her. And in the silence of the abbey cloister, the steady toll of bells carried once more, fading into the distance, merging with another sound, the rustle of pages turning, the pages of her unfinished life, blank where words might have been, waiting for the final chapter to be written. The rustle of blank pages lingered in the air, like whispers of stories untold, and in that hush, another sound began to swell, the low murmur of voices in prayer echoing off stone walls. The year was 1945, and within the cloisters of Pannonhalma Archabbey in Hungary, Princess Stephanie of Belgium, widow, countess, survivor of dynasties, sought her final refuge. The abbey, ancient and solemn, stood upon a hill, its towers rising over the countryside. Monks moved quietly through its corridors, their robes brushing the floor, their chants filling the vastness with measured calm. For centuries, the abbey had endured war and peace, kings and invaders, famine and prosperity. Its stones held the memory of generations, and now they sheltered an old woman who had lived through more history than most could imagine. Outside the abbey walls, the world was collapsing. The Second World War had reached its climax. Nazi forces, desperate and retreating, clung to what remained of their conquests. The Soviet Red Army advanced relentlessly, sweeping across Eastern and Central Europe. Hungary became a battleground, villages burned, cities bombed, rivers clogged with the wreckage of bridges. In such a landscape, even the most sacred places trembled. Stephanie, now 81, was frail. Her body bore the weight of decades, her hands thin, her movements slow, her breath often shallow. Elémère remained at her side, steadfast as he had always been, though he, too, was weakened by age. Together they had watched the storm gather and break. Rusovchi, their estate, had been seized for military use. Their possessions were scattered, their lands threatened. There was little left of the comfort they had once known. Yet within the abbey's walls, time seemed to slow. The rhythms of prayer, the tolling of bells, the candlelight flickering against carved altars, these gave her a final peace. She attended Mass when she could, sitting quietly in the pews, her eyes closed, lips moving silently. When she was too weak, she listened from her chamber, letting the chants drift in like a lullaby. Her thoughts wandered endlessly through memory. She saw her childhood at Laeken, the palace gardens fragrant with lilacs. Her brother's laughter before death claimed him. She saw Vienna glittering on her wedding day when she stood beside Rudolph at the altar, unknowing of the sorrow that awaited her. She saw Mayerling, its lodge forever frozen in silence, its tragedy etched into her soul. She saw Potocki's grave in the rain and the face of Elemer on the day she defied her father to marry him. She saw her father's empire in Africa, vast and cruel, and the weight of knowing that blood had mingled with her family's wealth. She saw her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, fiery and distant, the bond between them severed forever. Each memory returned like a tide, sometimes gentle, sometimes crashing. In her final months, she seemed to live in all times at once, the present blurred by the intensity of what had been. War's final months were merciless. The Red Army swept into Hungary in the spring of 1945, their arrival both liberation and terror. Villages emptied, soldiers took what they wished, fear spread quickly. The abbey itself was not spared anxiety. Plans had been drawn for it to be used as a field hospital. Monks whispered of confiscation, of desecration, of what might come when armies crossed its threshold. Stephanie and Elemer listened in silence. They had known palaces turned to prisons, estates to barracks, homes to ruins. Nothing seemed impossible. Yet within the abbey walls, they clung to the belief that sacred ground still carried power, that prayer and stone together might hold back destruction. In May, the war in Europe ended. Germany surrendered. The guns fell silent. Bells rang in capitals across the continent, though not always in joy. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. Empires dissolved. For Stephanie, it was not triumph she felt, only exhaustion. She had lived through the fall of one world in 1918 and now through the collapse of another. Her final summer passed quietly. The gardens of the abbey bloomed, though war had scarred the land. She sat by the windows looking out at fields swaying in the wind, her hands folded in her lap. Visitors came rarely. Most who had once known her were gone, scattered or silenced by time. She was, in the end, a figure remembered only faintly, her name tied still to tragedy, her later years obscured by disinterest. On the 23rd of August, 1945, Stephanie's long journey ended. The abbey bells tolled softly that morning as she slipped into stillness, her breath ceasing like a candle finally extinguished. She had lived through revolutions, epidemics, scandals, wars, and the death of dynasties. She had been crown princess, widow, countess, and exile, and now she was simply gone. Her body was carried into the crypt of the abbey, lowered into the earth beneath arches that had stood for centuries. Monks sang as the coffin was placed, their voices rising gently, not triumphant, but steady. A year later, Elemer joined her, buried beside her, their names carved together on stone. But the world beyond the abbey did not pause. Nations redrew borders. The Soviet presence hardened into occupation. Estates were seized, histories rewritten, memories erased. Rusovce would never again be theirs, never again a refuge of gardens and peace. The family line splintered further, her daughter distant still, her grandchildren living in a different world. And so her story closed, not with grandeur, but with silence. She had sought peace, and in the abbey, she found it at last. Yet even in death, questions lingered. Was she victim or survivor, pawn or defiant soul, forgotten princess, or witness to the darkest chapters of her age? The monks' voices faded. The crypt grew still. Candles guttered in the airless chamber. Dust drifted slowly through a shaft of light, circling downward until it vanished upon the stone floor. And in that silence, a single sound seemed to remain, the faint tolling of a bell, echoing as though from a great distance, fading not into conclusion, but into memory. The bell tolled softly in the crypt, its sound rolling outward into the fields and villages beyond, then fading until only silence remained. Yet memory is not so easily stilled. When the earth closed over Stephanie's coffin in the summer of 1945, her story did not vanish, but neither did it shine. It lingered, uncertain, caught between remembrance and forgetting. For those within the abbey walls, she was another soul entrusted to God, one more name added to the long roll of the dead. For the few who had known her personally in her final years, she was remembered as dignified, private, a woman who bore herself with reserve even in frailty. But beyond the cloister, beyond Hungary's hills, her death passed almost unnoticed. Europe was consumed with greater matters, rebuilding cities, burying millions, reckoning with horrors far larger than the life of one princess. Her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, did not come to the funeral. She had been disinherited the year before, the final mark of estrangement between mother and child. To some, this seemed cruel, the closing of a door that might never again be opened. To others, it was merely the last step in a quarrel that had long since ceased to be repairable. Whatever love once bound them had been consumed by bitterness, and in death, as in life, they remained apart. Among historians, her name appeared most often not in accounts of Belgium or Hungary, but in retellings of the Mayerling tragedy. Rudolph's death with Baroness Mary Vetsera fascinated Europe, and it was this story that cast its long shadow over Stephanie's memory. To many, she was the wronged wife, the princess betrayed, the sterile widow left behind. To others, she was incidental, a figure who appeared only at the edges of Rudolph's downfall. In either telling, her later decades all but disappeared, eclipsed by that single violent night. Yet her life had been far more than a footnote to scandal. She had been born into a young nation, Belgium's second princess, raised amid the optimism of her father's early reign. She had survived childhood illness, endured the collapse of her first marriage, defied her father to marry again for love. She had lived through the fall of two empires, and she had carried herself through exile, estrangement, and obscurity. Hers was not merely a tragic tale, but one of endurance, shaped by both sorrow and resolve. Still, the world often chooses simplicity over complexity. "The infected princess," whispered some, recalling the illnesses Rudolph had given her. "The Mayerling widow," said others, reducing her to a single moment of history. Rarely did they speak of her as Countess Launier, the title she bore with quiet dignity for 45 years. Rarely did they recall her charitable work, her domestic peace, her resilience through war. History preferred the scandal to the survival. Her memoir, I Should Have Been Empress, ensured that this select version of her life endured. By ending her story in 1889, she had allowed readers to imagine her forever as the young widow frozen in time, shaped entirely by the gunshot at Mayerling. Perhaps she intended it that way. Perhaps she preferred not to expose the grief and disappointments of her later decades. Or perhaps, having been defined by others all her life, she sought at last to define herself, even if it meant leaving half her story untold. In Belgium, she was remembered fitfully. Her father's legacy had grown darker each year, his name forever tied to the atrocities of the Congo Free State. The wealth and monuments he left behind stood as both pride and accusation. Stephanie, his daughter, was part of that inheritance, though her own life had unfolded far from Brussels. For Belgians in the post-war years, she was a distant figure, overshadowed by the stain of her father and by the dramas of European war. In Austria, too, her memory was blurred. The Habsburg dynasty had fallen, the monarchy abolished, the imperial palaces converted to museums. Tourists gazed at portraits of Rudolf, at relics of Mayerling, at the jewels and gowns of the vanished empire. Stephanie's name appeared in guides, but always tethered to Rudolf, rarely allowed to stand alone. To the Austrian imagination, she was forever the Belgian girl who had married into the empire, forever tied to its scandal. In Hungary, she was remembered more gently, if at all. At Rusovci, villagers spoke of her as a noblewoman who had lived quietly, who had given to charities, who had walked in gardens with her husband. When the estate passed into other hands after the war, her presence faded quickly, leaving behind only traces: a carved stone, a fading photograph, the memory of a countess who once lived among them. Thus her legacy scattered like dust, carried by winds into many directions, never settled. For some, she was a symbol of tragedy. For others, an example of endurance. For most, simply a forgotten princess of a forgotten empire. The truth lay somewhere between, a truth as complex as her life itself. The tolling of the bell lingered faintly in the crypt, its vibrations fading into stone, and with its fading came another silence, one not of death, but of memory. For when a life ends, it does not vanish at once. It lingers in the minds of others, shaped by remembrance or by forgetting. Princess Stephanie of Belgium, once crown princess of Austria-Hungary, had passed into that uncertain realm where memory and history intermingle, where reputations are reshaped by those who speak after the voice itself has fallen quiet. The first to reckon with her absence was her family, or perhaps more truthfully, her estranged family. Elizabeth Marie, her only child, did not come to the abbey, did not stand at her mother's grave. Their quarrel of years past had calcified into silence, and silence endured even into death. Stephanie had disinherited her daughter in her final will, an act of bitterness that revealed how deep the wound had been. For Elizabeth Marie, the Red Archduchess, her mother was a figure of restraint, of disappointment, of a world she had rejected. For Stephanie, her daughter was a rebel, one who had turned away not only from aristocracy, but from filial bond itself. In death, as in life, they remained divided. Among the remnants of the Belgian royal family, her passing stirred little echo. King Leopold II had died decades earlier, leaving behind scandal and infamy. His successors were distant relations, preoccupied with their own duties, their own challenges in the post-war world. Stephanie had long since been absent from Belgium's life, her name overshadowed by her father's brutal legacy in the Congo. To most Belgians, she was little more than a faded figure in photographs, a princess whose life had unfolded far from their land. In Austria, where she had once been crown princess, the memory was sharper, but still tinged with discomfort. To recall Stephanie was to recall Rudolf, and to recall Rudolf was to recall Mayerling. The tragedy had never been explained to satisfaction. Rumors of conspiracy, assassination, madness, and disease continued to swirl long after both he and Mary Vetsera were buried. Stephanie's presence in those years was inescapable, yet the court had worked to minimize her role, preferring silence to reminder. After the collapse of the monarchy in 1918, even that silence deepened, for the Republic had little interest in the sorrows of dynasties. And yet, her memoir ensured that her voice was not lost entirely. I Should Have Been Empress, published in 1935, offered her account of the years before, and including Mayerling. Readers found within it the portrait of a woman who believed herself wronged, who sought to justify her place in history. She painted herself as dutiful, as wronged by Rudolph's betrayals, as silenced by circumstance. What she omitted, however, was as striking as what she included. She wrote little of her later years, almost nothing of Elle-et-Mère, nothing of the decades she had lived after the empire fell. To the public, her story seemed to end in 1889, frozen at the lodge in Mayerling. This selective memory was both shield and prison. On one hand, it allowed Stephanie to present herself as a victim of circumstance, to shape the narrative in a way that might soften judgment. On the other, it ensured that much of her life would be forgotten, swallowed by silence. Historians, decades later, would puzzle over the omissions, seeking in archives and letters what she herself had chosen to conceal. In the years immediately after her death, Europe had little time to ponder her legacy. The world was consumed with rebuilding, with shifting borders, with confronting the horrors of the war just ended. Her name, once spoken in courts and newspapers, slipped into the margins. For most, she became a footnote. The widow of Mayerling, the woman who survived Rudolf, the princess whose life turned at 24 and never again regained its promise. But memory is not static. As time passed, scholars and biographers returned to her story. They examined her letters, her memoirs, the fragments left behind in archives. They traced her life from Belgium to Vienna, from Miramare to Rusovce, from ballrooms to cloisters. They asked what her life revealed about the role of women in dynasties, about the costs of arranged marriages, about the scars left by disease and scandal. They debated the fairness of her self-portrait, weighing her grievances against her silences. The public, however, remained most fascinated by Mayerling. The image of the young baroness dead beside the crown prince, of a dynasty thrown into crisis by scandal, held a grip that no later chapter could erase. Stephanie's later decades, her love for Elémère, her quiet life at Rusovce, her death in an abbey, these seemed pale compared to the intensity of that single night in 1889. For her, it was both a curse and a truth. Her life was defined by a tragedy not of her making, yet inescapably hers to bear. And so her legacy fractured. To some, she was the wronged wife, betrayed by a husband who infected her with disease, left barren, left to endure humiliation. To others, she was complicit in her own misfortune, stiff and unyielding, a woman who could not adapt to the demands of her position. To many, she was simply forgotten, her name blurred among the many daughters and widows of Europe's vanished courts. Yet in the abbey crypt where she lay, stone bore her name still: Stephanie, Princess of Belgium, Countess Launier. It was a modest inscription for a woman who had once stood at the center of empire. Visitors came rarely, their footsteps soft in the dim light, their eyes pausing upon the name before moving on. She was part of history, but not central to it. She was remembered, but faintly. Her story remains a reminder of how lives are shaped, not only by choice, but by forces far beyond control, by dynastic politics, by disease, by scandal, by war. It is a reminder, too, of how history remembers unevenly, clinging to dramatic moments while letting decades slip away. Stephanie's life was long, filled with travel, with love, with estrangement, with survival. Yet the world remembers her for one winter night in Mayerling. Perhaps in some sense, she chose this herself. By ending her memoir at that point, by leaving blank pages where the rest of her life might have been, she allowed history to freeze her there. She became not the elderly woman of Rusovce, not the quiet countess in the abbey, but the crown princess, abandoned by fate at the very moment her story might have blossomed. In the silence of memory, the bell's toll fades into another sound, not stone, not chant, but the whisper of footsteps upon gravel, visitors passing through the abbey grounds, pausing, wondering, then moving on. Each step echoes briefly, then vanishes, like her story itself, half remembered, half forgotten, always just beyond the reach of certainty. The gravel shifts, stones grind underfoot, and the sound merges with another image. The crunch of boots in snow, snow that once fell softly in Vienna in the winter of 1889, when a widow's carriage carried her away from the palace gates into a future she did not choose. The crunch of boots in snow echoed through the streets of Vienna in that bitter winter of 1889. A carriage rolled heavily from the palace gates, its wheels muffled by slush, its windows veiled in frost. Inside, Princess Stephanie sat wrapped in black, her face pale, her eyes fixed not on the city she passed, but on the empty distance beyond the glass. Meyerling had shattered her life, and now she rode away from the court that no longer welcomed her. The days immediately after Rudolph's death had been a blur of confusion, secrecy, and whispered speculation. The imperial family struggled to present a dignified facade, even as rumors swirled like winter winds. Official statements spoke of sudden illness, then of tragedy, but never of the truth as it was known. A suicide pact, a violent death, a dynasty destabilized. The Habsburg court, ever rigid, recoiled from scandal with icy detachment. Stephanie was left in an impossible position. Widowed at 24, infertile and unwelcome in the very house that had once embraced her, as a symbol of hope. She remained in Vienna for a time, bound by her daughter Elizabeth Marie, who could not be removed from the dynasty. The child, only 5 years old, was now both consolation and chain. Stephanie longed to take her back to Belgium, to raise her among familiar faces and gentler landscapes. But Emperor Franz Joseph refused. Elizabeth Marie was a Habsburg, born into the empire, and would be raised in Vienna. Stephanie's pleas were met with formality, never compassion. The child stayed, and so did she. The months turned into years, and her position grew lonelier. At court functions, she was treated with courtesy, but no warmth. Whispers followed her through corridors. Some blamed her coldness for Rudolph's despair. Others pitied her as a victim of his recklessness. None, it seemed, saw her as simply a woman enduring grief. The Empress Elizabeth, herself a tragic figure, kept her distance, offering no sisterly bond. The emperor remained distant, absorbed in duty, unwilling to dwell on the personal. Stephanie drifted through receptions and ceremonies like a ghost, present but unwanted. She filled her days with routine, her evenings with solitude. In her private chambers, she kept portraits of her daughter close, writing letters that were often intercepted by the strict guardians of dynastic upbringing. The child grew under watchful eyes not her own. Even when they were together, Stephanie felt the distance, for every gesture reminded her that her daughter belonged not to her, but to the House of Habsburg. It was in this atmosphere of isolation that she found solace in Count Artur Potocki, a Polish nobleman of refinement and loyalty. He was not a figure of politics, not a pawn in dynastic games, but simply a man who treated her with kindness. Their companionship grew into affection, a balm against her loneliness. For the first time since girlhood, she allowed herself to believe in tenderness without calculation. But fate was unrelenting. His illness came swiftly, robbing him first of voice, then of strength, and by 1890 he too was gone. Once again she stood by a grave, listening to rain fall on stone, her heart closed in sorrow. The dual blows of Rudolph and Potocki left her hollow. Vienna became intolerable. Every corridor whispered Meyerling. Every glance reminded her of scandal. Every shadow seemed to echo Rudolph's absence. And yet she could not leave, bound still by her daughter. She retreated when she could, traveling abroad, wandering the Mediterranean shores, breathing the air of Malta, Sicily, Corfu, Tunisia. Each journey was an attempt to outrun grief, to find distraction in landscapes where the tragedy of Meyerling did not follow her footsteps. But grief, like shadow, could not be left behind. It traveled with her, seated at her side on every ship, every carriage, every quiet night in foreign rooms. In Belgium, her father, Leopold II, watched from afar. He cared little for her sorrow, less for her freedom. To him, she remained an asset, a piece to be arranged once more on the dynastic chessboard. He proposed marriages, pressed her toward alliances, considered her future not in terms of happiness, but in political gain. He dreamed of her joining hands with Franz Ferdinand, nephew of the emperor and new heir. She resisted, weary of arrangements that ignored her heart. But Leopold's vision was unyielding, and their correspondence grew strained, filled with commands and refusals. By the late 1890s, the paths of duty and desire diverged more sharply. Stephanie encountered Count Elémer Longnier, a Hungarian aristocrat, refined and thoughtful. In him, she discovered something she had never known with Rudolf, a partner who valued her as a woman, not as an emblem of dynasty. Their love grew quietly, nourished by long conversations, by shared solitude, by the rarest of things in her world, affection freely given. When word of their bond reached her father, fury followed. A princess of Belgium, widow of the crown prince, to marry beneath her station? To Leopold, it was an outrage. He forbade the union, thundered against it, and warned of disgrace. Yet for the first time, Stephanie chose defiance. She had bowed to politics as a child, endured betrayal as a wife, carried scandal as a widow. She would not bow again. In March 1900, she married Elémer at Miramare Castle, near Trieste, without her father's blessing. The price was steep. She lost her imperial titles, was cast aside by court society, and severed her ties with her father forever. He forbade her to attend her mother's funeral in 1902, refused to see her again, and at his death disinherited her, along with her sisters, leaving most of his fortune to his mistress. But Stephanie accepted the cost. She had chosen love, not duty, and in Elémer's quiet devotion she found peace. Together they made their home at Rusovka, far from the courts of Vienna and Brussels. The estate, with its wide gardens and serene halls, became her refuge. Here she was not crown princess, not pawn of dynasties, but simply wife and mistress of a household. She walked in the gardens at dusk, the air cool, the leaves stirring, her husband at her side. The world beyond might judge, might scorn, but within those walls she belonged. Yet history is never silent for long. In the distance, the empire shifted, borders trembled, alliances fractured. Sarajevo waited, and with it a bullet that would again alter the world she knew. The leaves in the Rusovsky gardens stirred more fiercely, the wind rising, carrying with it a faint tolling of bells from a distant city, Sarajevo, where a carriage rolled slowly through crowded streets, and the echo of shots was about to ring across Europe. The wind carried the faint tolling of bells from Sarajevo, their sound mingling with the memory of gunfire. And in that mingling, the old world began to unravel. It was June 1914, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie had shaken the Austro-Hungarian Empire to its core. The shots of Gavrilo Princip echoed not only through the narrow streets of Bosnia, but across Europe, setting in motion a chain of events that would ignite a war greater than any the continent had ever known. For Stephanie, the irony was sharp. Years earlier, her father, Leopold II, had pressed her toward marriage with Franz Ferdinand, imagining a match that would restore her prestige. She had resisted, and fate had carried her elsewhere. Now the man once considered for her hand was dead, his blood staining the cobblestones, his death used as pretext for demands and ultimatums. She watched from Rusovsha as the empire to which she still, in some measure, belonged, moved inexorably toward conflict. In July, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Alliances triggered responses. Russia mobilized. Germany declared war. France and Britain followed. Within weeks, Europe was engulfed in fire. For Stephanie, the war was a double sorrow. She was Belgian by birth, and in August, Germany invaded her homeland, sweeping aside its neutrality, turning its towns and villages into battlefields. News of atrocities reached her swiftly. Civilians shot, churches burned, refugees fleeing in endless streams. The nation of her childhood, small and proud, was crushed beneath armies, and she could do nothing. Yet she lived in Hungary, tied by marriage to the empire that was allied with Germany, the empire that marched against her native land. The contradiction was unbearable. In her heart, she mourned for Belgium, but in her daily life, she was surrounded by those who cheered victories of the Central Powers, who spoke of Belgium as the enemy. Conversations grew cautious. Her loyalties were quietly questioned. She felt the weight of being out of place once more, a woman divided between nations, never fully at home in either. At Rusovcha, she and Elimir withdrew as much as they could. The estate, lying away from the front lines, spared them the devastation of shells and trenches. Its gardens still bloomed, its halls still echoed with familiar sounds. But even here, the war pressed in. Supplies grew scarce, prices rose, and the faces of neighbors were marked by loss. Young men went to fight and did not return. Families mourned silently, their grief a mirror of the grief she had carried all her life. She devoted herself to charity as many women of rank did. She organized aid for the wounded, supported hospitals, and helped displaced families. Her gestures could not end the war, but they brought comfort in small ways. In these acts she found purpose, a way to ease her own helplessness. Yet the contradiction remained. Every effort she made on Hungarian soil indirectly aided the cause that oppressed her native Belgium. She lived in a web of contradictions, each step entangling her further. By 1916, the war had consumed millions of lives. The old emperor, Franz Joseph, died that year, after nearly 7 decades on the throne. Stephanie and Elimir traveled to Vienna for his funeral, walking once more in the shadow of the Hofburg. The city was draped in black, the funeral procession solemn, the air heavy with mourning. Soon after, they witnessed the coronation of Charles and his wife Zita, young and hopeful, symbols of renewal in a weary empire. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that change might come. Charles spoke of peace, of reform, of a new direction for the empire. But the tides of war were stronger than good intentions. The battles raged on, the alliances hardened, and hunger spread across the empire. By 1918, Austria-Hungary itself was breaking apart. Nations declared independence, borders shifted, monarchs fled. The war ended in November, and with it ended the empire that had once been her prison and her stage. For Stephanie, the collapse was both loss and liberation. She was no longer tied to a dynasty that had long rejected her. The titles she had once held meant little in the New World. Rusovci now lay in Czechoslovakia, its land governed by a republic rather than a monarchy. Yet she and Elimir were allowed to remain, spared exile, spared confiscation. While Habsburg cousins fled to Switzerland or Spain, she stayed in her home, surrounded by gardens and quiet. It was a strange kind of freedom. No longer bound by court duties, she could live more as she wished. She traveled, she read, she entertained guests, though on a smaller scale than the courts of old. Her days were filled with small rhythms, not great ceremonies. In that simplicity, she found something resembling peace. But history never loosens its grip entirely. Her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, now grown, became a source of pain rather than solace. Known in Vienna as the Red Archduchess, she embraced socialism, shocking the aristocracy. Her personal life scandalized society. Her marriage crumbled. Her affairs drew whispers. Her politics divided friends. For Stephanie, who had endured decades of restraint and duty, her daughter's rebellion was unbearable. They quarreled bitterly, words spoken in anger, wounds opened anew. By 1924, they had severed ties completely. Mother and daughter did not speak again. In the silence that followed, Stephanie turned further inward. She wrote her memoirs, published in 1935, shaping her past into a narrative she could live with. But she stopped the story at 1889, at Mayerling, as though the decades since had never truly existed. To her, perhaps, they had not. Her life, in her own telling, ended with Rudolph's death. Everything after was shadow, echo, survival. And so she walked her gardens at Rusovtsa, her silver hair glinting in the sun, her steps measured, her eyes reflective. She had been princess, crown princess, widow, countess, mother, exile, survivor. She had lived through the fall of 2 empires, through war and hunger, through estrangement and loss. Yet the world still remembered her only for that single night in 1889, for the silence of Mayerling. As she walked, leaves stirred around her feet, whispering in the wind. The whisper grew louder, became not leaves but the turning of newspaper pages, pages filled with headlines of a new decade, of movements rising, of leaders shouting to crowds, of a darkness spreading once more across Europe. The rustle of newspaper pages grew louder, their edges snapping in the draft of a summer window. Headlines shouted of men rising to power, of crowds filling public squares, of nations leaning toward voices that promised order and destiny. Across Europe, the 1930s were a season of tension, of slogans and parades, of fear disguised as certainty. For Stephanie, sitting in the quiet of Rusovtsa, the words on those pages carried a familiar weight. She had lived long enough to recognize the signs. She remembered her father, Leopold II, and his relentless hunger for empire, how ambition clothed itself in grandeur while concealing cruelty. She remembered Rudolph, her husband, consumed by inner storms, intoxicated by reckless causes. And now she saw echoes of these forces on a continental scale. Leaders stirring masses, bending history to their will, promising greatness, yet sowing destruction. In Austria, the land that had once crowned her crown princess, crowds lifted their arms in salute. Adolf Hitler, born in Braunau, returned as conqueror in 1938. The Anschluss absorbed Austria into the German Reich. The Hofburg Palace, where she had once walked stiffly in silks, now housed the pageantry of a new regime. Flags bearing swastikas draped the same balconies where Habsburgs had once appeared. Vienna, the city of her youth and her sorrow, cheered a new master. From Rusovtsa, she read these accounts with silent astonishment. The empire that had rejected her was long gone, its monarch scattered. Yet to see Austria vanish into another power, to see the palaces repurposed for propaganda, must have stirred a strange ache. She had once imagined herself empress, imagined walking those corridors with authority. Now they belonged to another, and their grandeur had been turned into theater for a very different stage. Hungary, where she made her home, stood in uneasy alliance with Germany. Nationalist voices grew louder, laws tightened, suspicion deepened. Ellemer, her husband, navigated the currents as best he could, loyal to his country but cautious of entanglements. Their household grew quieter. Guests came less often. Conversations lowered their tones, as if walls themselves might listen. In her solitude, Stephanie turned again to memory. She was in her 70s now, her body slower, her step unsteady. She moved through the halls of Rusovtsa like a ghost of her younger self. Her memoir had been published. Her words were in the world, yet she knew they were incomplete. Sometimes she would pause by her desk, lay her hand on a blank page, as if tempted to write more. But the pen never moved. She had chosen to end her story at Mayerling, and she remained faithful to that choice. The silence of those later decades became, in its way, another form of testimony. The estrangement from her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, still ached. Elizabeth lived her life loudly, embracing causes that scandalized Vienna, pursuing lovers, speaking boldly against tradition. The newspapers called her the Red Archduchess, a title both mocking and admiring. For Stephanie, every headline was a reminder of what had been lost. She never reached out, never softened. The silence between them grew as final as death, though both lived on. The 1930s grew darker. Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, carving the nation apart. Rusovcha, once comfortably nestled in the quiet of Central Europe, now lay in a region whose borders shifted with every treaty, every army's advance. The estate was eyed by officials, its grounds surveyed, its future uncertain. Plans emerged to use it for military purposes, to strip it of its identity as a home and turn it into an instrument of war. Stephanie bore these rumors with the calm of one who had already lost much. Palaces, titles, fortunes, these had been taken from her before. If Rusovcha were taken too, she would endure. Yet the thought of losing her final refuge, the place where she and Elimer had built a life of their own, weighed heavily upon her heart. By 1939, the storm broke in full. Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began. Once again, Europe was in flames. The pattern seemed cruelly familiar. Armies on the march, alliances locked, nations overrun. For Stephanie, it was a final repetition of the cycle she had known since girlhood. She was 75 years old and she had lived through wars, collapses, revolutions. Now she would see one more. The war years were quieter at Rusovchi than in the cities, but fear was never far. Supplies dwindled, soldiers requisitioned what they pleased, rumors of atrocities reached even the countryside. She withdrew further into seclusion, walking her gardens when weather allowed, praying in her chambers, listening for news of the world beyond. Elimer remained at her side, his loyalty undiminished. Together they bore the war as they had borne life, quietly, with dignity, with patience. Yet the war grew closer. By 1944, the Red Army advanced westward. Hungary became a battlefield caught between Nazi desperation and Soviet momentum. The future narrowed to survival. Friends fled, estates were abandoned, lives overturned. The abbey at Pannonhalma, ancient and solemn, offered them sanctuary. The monks, bound to their prayers, opened their doors to those who sought refuge. It was there, in 1945, that Stephanie would breathe her last. But before that moment, as she watched the war tighten around her, she must have recalled once more the long arc of her life. A girl born in Laeken, a bride in Vienna, a widow at Meierling, a countess at Rusovca, a wanderer through empires that rose and fell. She had survived what many could not. But survival had not freed her from sorrow. It had only stretched it across time. And as she sat by her window in those late years, the world beyond collapsing into rubble and smoke, she might have heard another sound within her memory. Not boots, not guns, but the faint whisper of a gunshot long past, a shot fired in a hunting lodge in 1889. That echo never left her. It lived in her still, even as another war roared beyond her walls. The smoke of battle drifted across Hungary, blurring horizon and sky, and in that haze another image formed, the outline of a monastery tower, its bells poised to ring, waiting for the moment when silence would again fall upon the land. The outline of the monastery tower emerged through the drifting smoke of war, its bells hanging silent, waiting for a moment to toll. The tower belonged to Pannonhalma Arkabi, an ancient Benedictine house in Hungary, whose stones had endured 1,000 storms. For centuries, its cloisters had echoed with chant and prayer, while kingdoms rose and fell beyond its walls. And now, in the spring of 1945, it became a refuge for the last days of a woman who had once been destined for an imperial crown. Princess Stephanie of Belgium, now Countess Launier, arrived at the abbey with her husband Elimer as war closed around them. Rusovs, their beloved estate, lay vulnerable to soldiers, to confiscation, to the shifting tides of battle. The abbey, though no safer in truth, offered the promise of shelter in its sacredness. Monks welcomed them with quiet courtesy, guiding them through cool stone corridors into chambers sparse but serene. For Stephanie, Weary and frail, the abbey's silence felt like a final resting place before rest itself. Outside, Hungary trembled. The German army retreated in desperation. The Soviets advanced with unyielding force. Villages were emptied, homes burned, lives scattered. Hunger stalked the land. Armies spoke of turning monasteries into hospitals, of using cloisters for barracks, of stripping altars for timber. The abbey itself faced requisition. Yet within its walls, the rhythm of prayer endured. Morning and evening, the monks' voices rising above the chaos, steady as the turning of seasons. For Stephanie, those chants were balm. She attended when she could, though her steps were slow and her breath shallow. Sitting in the dim light of the church, she closed her eyes and let the Latin words wash over her. They were the same prayers she had heard as a child in Laeken, as a bride in Vienna, as a widow in Rusovce. Through them, she felt the thread of continuity, unbroken even as the world shattered. Her body, however, could no longer bear the weight of years. At 81, she was fragile, her hands thin, her face marked by the passage of time. She tired easily, resting often in her chamber, looking out through a narrow window at the rolling hills beyond. Ellemer remained at her side, his devotion unshaken, though he too bore the burden of age. Together they spoke little of war, little of politics. Their conversations turned instead to memory, to shared journeys, to the life they had built in defiance of kings. In those quiet hours, Stephanie's mind wandered freely. She recalled her childhood garden at Laeken, fragrant with lilacs. She saw again her brother's small coffin, the first grief of her life. She remembered Vienna's gilded halls, the weight of jewels upon her head, the vows spoken beside Rudolph, the music that seemed then so triumphant. She saw Mayerling in winter, the silent lodge, the gunshot that echoed through her soul forever. She saw Pataki's grave, rain falling upon stone. She saw Miramare, where she had wed Ellemer in defiance, gaining love and losing station. She saw Rusovce in springtime, its fields bright, its rooms alive with laughter, before war darkened the horizon. Each memory was sharp, yet softened by time, as though she now looked upon her own life through a veil. Regret mingled with gratitude, sorrow with endurance. She'd been many things: daughter, bride, widow, mother, exile, survivor. She had lived through wars and dynasties, through betrayals and reconciliations, through silence and defiance. She'd been nearly forgotten, yet she had endured. Her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, came to mind too, though the thought was painful. The silence between them had lasted more than 2 decades. No letter arrived, no word of reconciliation. Mother and child had parted irrevocably, each carrying pride too heavy to set down. In her final months, Stephanie must have known that the estrangement would not be healed. Perhaps she prayed for her daughter in secret. Perhaps she simply let the silence stand. Another sorrow folded into her long life. The war raged on outside the abbey, but within its walls, time slowed. Days passed in prayer and quiet. The monks moved through their routines, tending to their duties with calm persistence. Candles burned in chapels, casting shadows that danced upon stone. At night, the abbey grew hushed, save for the faint toll of bells marking the hours. In that rhythm, Stephanie's own breath grew lighter, slower, more uncertain. On the morning of the 23rd of August, 1945, the bells tolled softly as her long journey ended. She died quietly, her hand resting in Ellemer's, her eyes closed, her face serene. The woman who had once stood at the altar of Vienna, who had once been poised to become empress, now slipped into silence in a monastic cell. Her coffin was carried into the crypt, lowered into the earth beneath arches that had stood for centuries. Monks sang as stone closed over her, their voices steady, unhurried, eternal. A year later, Ellemer would join her, buried at her side, their names carved together on stone. But the world did not pause for mourning. Hungary was swallowed into Soviet influence. Rusov's was seized. Borders were redrawn. Her resting place, solemn and quiet, became a forgotten corner in a continent remade. Her name faded from memory, spoken rarely, her life reduced to a single word in history's index, Mayerling. Yet within the Abbey crypt, silence endures. Candles still burn, bells still toll, monks still chant as they have for 1,000 years. Her story, folded into stone, waits for those who pause to remember. The candles gutter in the still air, wax dripping slowly downward. One flame trembles, bends, and almost dies, yet at the last moment steadies itself, as though refusing to yield entirely to darkness. The candle flame wavered, nearly extinguished, then steadied again, trembling in the still air of the Abbey crypt. In that small, fragile light was a symbol of memory itself, faltering, uncertain, yet refusing to vanish entirely. So it was with Stephanie's story after her death. She was buried quietly at Pannonhalma in August 1945, her coffin sealed in stone as the monks' chants faded into silence. Outside, the world moved on, too quickly for her memory to be carried with care. The Europe into which she had been born no longer existed. Belgium was free again, but her name carried little weight there, overshadowed by the long and bitter shadow of her father, Leopold Nicent, whose Congo Empire had become synonymous with cruelty. Austria-Hungary had dissolved decades earlier. Its palaces now belonged to republics, its ceremonies dissolved into memory. Hungary itself, where she had chosen to live and where she died, was now under Soviet occupation, its future rewritten by foreign powers. There was little space for remembrance of a princess whose life belonged to another century. Her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, did not come to her funeral, did not weep at her coffin. The estrangement that had hardened between them remained unbroken to the end. Elizabeth lived on until 1963, pursuing her own turbulent path, carrying the title of Red Archduchess in newspapers, a symbol of rebellion against the very world her mother had embodied. In that silence between mother and daughter, memory fractured further. The grandchildren of Stephanie grew up without their grandmother's presence, without her voice or her hand. In the intimate spaces of family, as in the vast stage of history, she was absent. What remained were fragments. The memoir she had published in 1935, I Should Have Been Empress, circulated in libraries, its pages offering readers the story she wished them to know. Yet it was incomplete by design. She stopped at Mayerling, as if her life had ended there, as if the decades that followed were not worth recounting. Scholars later noted the silence as loudly as the words themselves. Why did she not write of Elimir, of Rusovts, of the battles for inheritance, of her estrangement from her daughter? Was it pride? Was it sorrow? Or was it the recognition that the public would not care? For the public imagination cared for Mayerling above all else. The death of Crown Prince Rudolf and Baroness Mary Vetsera fascinated Europe for generations. Theories multiplied. Was it suicide? Was it murder? Was there conspiracy? Was there despair? Plays, novels, and films told and retold the tale, each reshaping it for a new audience. In nearly all, Stephanie appeared only as shadow, the betrayed wife, the discarded princess, the woman left barren by disease. She was a figure of pity, but rarely of interest. Mayerling consumed Rudolph's story and hers alike, reducing long lives to a single violent night. In Vienna, where she had once walked as crown princess, little trace of her presence remained. Tourists admired the Hofburg, its palaces, its galleries, but they did not speak her name. They spoke, instead of Sisi, the beloved empress, or of Rudolph, the tragic prince. Stephanie lingered only in the margins. In Brussels, too, she was little remembered, her image tied to the scandal of her father rather than her own life. Even in Hungary, where she had built her refuge at Rusovci, her memory dimmed quickly after her death. Yet memory is not erased entirely. In archives, her letters remained. In photographs, her face looked back, solemn, dignified, marked by sorrow. Biographers returned to her story, piecing together the years she had left blank. They found in her a life emblematic of so many royal daughters of the 19th century. Born to duty, sacrificed to dynasty, betrayed by circumstance, struggling to carve space for love and dignity within rigid systems. She was not singular, but she was not unimportant. Through her, the costs of empire, of arranged marriage, of dynastic ambition could be traced in human form. Still, the story the world preferred was not of her resilience, but of her tragedy. She remained, above all, the wife of Rudolf, the woman linked forever to Mayerling. Even her title, the infected princess, carried the mark of what he had given her, the betrayal of disease that left her infertile. It was a cruel legacy, but one she herself acknowledged. In making Mayerling the endpoint of her memoir, she seemed to accept that history would remember her not for survival, but for sorrow. And yet, there is another way to look upon her life. She was not only widow, not only victim. She was also the woman who defied her father to marry for love, who built a home in Rusovci, who endured exile without surrendering her dignity. She was the woman who survived empires, who watched monarchies collapse around her, who lived long enough to see a world remade twice over. Few of her generation bore witness to so much. In this, she was more than tragedy. She was endurance itself. Today, the abbey where she rests still stands, its bells still tolling, its monks still chanting. Beneath its arches, her coffin lies among countless others, names fading, stories dimming, yet not gone. For each visitor who pauses, for each historian who turns a page, for each voice that recalls her, the candle flame trembles again, refusing extinction. The candle flickers once more, the wax bending under heat, until it forms a single drop. Slowly it falls, striking stone with the faintest sound. The drop spreads in silence, glistening briefly before fading into the porous surface. And in that vanishing, another image begins. Not stone, not wax, but the glint of frost on a carriage window, as a young widow once more rode through the snow of Vienna, wondering what remained for her after Mayerling. The frost on the carriage window blurred the world outside, turning lamplight into hazy orbs, muffling the outlines of familiar streets. Inside, Stephanie sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the cold glass. Vienna lay beyond. Vienna that had once received her with fanfare, that had once prepared her for a throne. Now it received her again, but not as bride or crown princess. She returned as widow, marked by scandal, her place altered forever. The months after Mayerling were like moving through ice. The court draped itself in mourning, yet mourning was never simple when the death itself could not be spoken of plainly. Official proclamations softened the truth. Whispered explanations shifted. Silence grew heavier. Within palace walls, Rudolf's name was barely mentioned, except in hushed tones, and always with unease. And Stephanie, who bore his title, his child, and his memory, became a living reminder of what had happened. At receptions, courtiers greeted her with bows and murmured condolences, yet their eyes slid away quickly. Some pitied her, others judged her. Many simply avoided her. To speak with her was to recall the scandal. To look upon her was to remember the heir who had left the empire in shock. Even the Empress Elizabeth, her mother-in-law, seemed to keep her distance. Elizabeth, too, had been scarred by loss. Her son gone, her family fractured, but grief did not draw them together. It separated them, each bearing sorrow alone, unwilling or unable to share. The emperor himself, Franz Joseph, remained formal. He treated her with correctness, never cruelty, but never with warmth. For him, duty outweighed intimacy. He turned his focus to preserving what remained of his empire, and Stephanie, widowed and infertile, no longer figured in dynastic plans. She was acknowledged, but she was not included. She was present, but she was not wanted. Her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, was still a child, and it was through her that Stephanie clung to purpose. Yet even here, the court's control was firm. The little girl was a Habsburg princess, and her upbringing was directed by imperial guardians. Stephanie saw her often, but never freely. Their time together was measured, observed, restricted. The bond of mother and daughter was constrained by walls, by attendants, by the will of an emperor. For Stephanie, this was perhaps the hardest loss of all. She had endured illness, humiliation, betrayal, and now widowhood. But to be denied the freedom to raise her own child, this pierced deepest. She wrote letters to her daughter when they were apart, carefully chosen words of affection, but the letters passed through many hands before reaching small fingers. Sometimes, she suspected, they did not reach at all. To escape the suffocation of court, she turned outward. She traveled, as much as circumstance allowed. In Italy, in France, in the Mediterranean islands, she sought distraction. The sea, with its endless horizons, seemed to offer relief from confinement. She breathed the salt air, walked unfamiliar streets, looked upon faces that did not know her. Yet wherever she went, her identity followed. She was the widow of Meerling, the barren princess, the woman tied forever to scandal. Even in distant places, whispers trailed her steps. And then, when she had begun to believe she might find solace in Count Artur Potocki, fate struck once more. His illness robbed him of voice, then of life, leaving her alone again. The memory of rain upon his grave haunted her travels, each drop echoing as if it fell within her own heart. Vienna grew colder. By the early 1890s, she was little more than a figure in black at the edges of court ceremonies. The grandeur of the Hofburg, the glitter of balls, the solemnity of receptions, all unfolded without her at the center. She had once imagined herself one day empress, standing beside Rudolph on the throne of a vast empire. Now she stood in shadows, unacknowledged, unnecessary, invisible. Her father, Leopold II, still pressed for solutions. He wrote to her with stern insistence, reminding her of duty, urging her toward remarriage. He imagined alliances that might restore her position, mend the damage of Meerling. He suggested Franz Ferdinand, the new heir, as her match. But for Stephanie, the thought of returning to Vienna's dynastic cage was unbearable. She had lived the cost once. She would not surrender again. It was in this period of uncertainty, of mourning stretched too long, that she began to imagine another life. She longed for a place where love, not politics, might guide her. When she met Elémère Launier, she saw in him not an heir, not a political figure, but a man who cared for her simply as she was. Their bond offered her the possibility of escape from Vienna, from her father's commands, from the ice of widowhood. The choice would not come immediately. For years she remained in limbo, neither fully at court nor entirely free. Yet the seed was planted, and the cold halls of Vienna began to feel more like a prison than ever. By the late 1890s, she knew she must leave. Meerling had ended her first life. Now she sought to begin a second, to marry for love, even at the cost of station, to live beyond the reach of Vienna's shadows, to become something other than a tragic emblem of scandal. But before that moment came, she endured years of drift, years of watching from the edges. She was a widow still in her 20s, her child slipping from her reach, her father's letters pressing like chains. She attended receptions where no one looked her in the eye, dinners where her presence was tolerated but not embraced. She walked through gardens where whispers followed her steps, and always she carried Meerling. It was in her silence, in the way her hands folded in her lap, in the solemnity of her gaze. The court saw it too, though they spoke of it rarely. She was a reminder of what they preferred to forget, and so they pushed her aside. Snow fell again in Vienna, coating rooftops, silencing streets. Carriages moved slowly, their wheels grinding against ice. Stephanie sat by her window looking out, her face reflected faintly in the glass. The frost blurred the world, but not her thoughts. She knew she could not remain. She knew she must defy, must choose for herself at last. Her breath fogged the glass, then faded, leaving only the frost once more. Beyond the frost, a distant horizon seemed to beckon, as if waiting for her to step beyond the cage. And in that fading breath, another image formed. The outline of Miramare Castle, perched above the Adriatic, where vows would one day be spoken again, not for dynasty, but for love. The outline of Miramare Castle gleamed against the pale sky, its white stone walls rising above the Adriatic. Waves struck the cliffs below, foaming, breaking, and retreating, their rhythm older than dynasties. It was here, on the 22nd of March, 1900, that Stephanie of Belgium, once crown princess of Austria-Hungary, stood again at an altar. She was 35 years old, a widow marked by scandal, estranged from her father, disregarded by Vienna. Yet here she chose to begin anew, not for dynasty, but for love. Her bridegroom was Count Elémer Longye, a Hungarian aristocrat. He was not a prince of empire, not a figure of politics, not a man chosen by royal councils. He was of good birth, refined, respected, but to kings, he was beneath her station. To Leopold II, her father, the match was intolerable. He had thundered against it in letters, forbidding, warning, condemning. But Stephanie had borne too many commands in her life. She had bowed as a child, yielded as a bride, endured as a widow. Now she chose defiance. The ceremony was smaller than her first wedding, lacking the grandeur of Vienna's vast cathedral, lacking the procession of archdukes and ambassadors. But in its quiet dignity, it was more hers. Elémer stood beside her, devoted, unshaken, willing to give up much for her hand. He had even converted to Catholicism in the hope of softening Leopold's anger, though the king was unmoved. To Leopold, this was betrayal. To Stephanie, it was freedom. The price, however, was steep. By marrying outside of dynastic approval, she forfeited her imperial titles. She was no longer addressed as Imperial and Royal Highness, no longer Crown Princess, no longer future Empress. She became Countess Longye, a title respectable but modest compared to what she had once borne. Vienna's court shut its doors to her. Her father turned his face away, forbidding her to attend her mother's funeral in 1902, refusing to see her again even on his deathbed. When he died in 1909, he left his fortune largely to his mistress, Caroline Lacroix, and Stephanie received only a share after bitter legal battles. Yet Stephanie accepted these losses. For the first time in her life, her choice had been her own. She had not been arranged, not exchanged, not maneuvered. She had chosen a man for affection, and he had chosen her for herself. After the glitter and ice of Vienna, after the cold severity of her father, this bond was a kind of salvation. Together, she and Elémer made their home at Rusovce, an estate near Pressburg, today's Bratislava. The mansion was spacious, with gardens stretching wide, shaded by trees, surrounded by fields. Here she found the peace she had longed for. No longer trapped by court rituals, she walked her gardens at dusk, leaned upon Elémer's arm, listened to the quiet hum of the countryside. In the evenings, they read together, received a few trusted friends, or sat in silence, content with each other's company. For Stephanie, Rusovce became what Vienna had never been, a home. She had been raised in palaces, but they had never felt hers. She had been wedded in splendor, but it had never been for love. Now, in the quiet halls of this estate, she lived not as pawn or emblem, but as wife. The loss of titles mattered little against the gain of dignity. Still, her father's shadow reached across the years. Leopold II had not forgiven, and his anger remained. He scorned his daughters for marrying beneath them. He disinherited, he raged, he clung to resentment until the end. When his death revealed the vast fortune he had tied to Caroline Lacroix, scandal erupted. Stephanie and her sisters, outraged, fought in court. Newspapers reported every detail, framing it as another chapter in the king's long and controversial life. After 5 years of dispute, Stephanie secured 5 million francs, a victory yet bitter, for it came not as gift but as settlement. While battles unfolded in courts, battles also shaped Europe. The old continent trembled with unrest, strikes, assassinations, shifting borders. Yet within Rusovci, life was calmer. The fields yielded their harvests, the gardens bloomed, and Stephanie filled her days with charity, with travel, with writing. She had lost much, but she had gained what mattered most to her, a partnership built on affection rather than calculation. The contrast with her first marriage was stark. Rudolf had been volatile, reckless, unfaithful. He had left her infected, infertile, betrayed. With Elémère, there was no betrayal, no recklessness. He was steady, loyal, enduring. To be loved gently after so much sorrow was for her a victory larger than crowns. Yet she was not entirely free of grief. Her daughter Elizabeth Marie remained a part of her life, but not always with ease. The girl grew into a young woman under Habsburg guardianship, shaped by values different from her mother's. Their bond strained over time, the shadows of Mayerling lying between them, the weight of expectation pressing hard. What had begun as closeness would one day unravel into estrangement. But for now, in the first years of her second marriage, Stephanie allowed herself to feel content. She and Elémère traveled, sometimes to Italy, sometimes to friends in Austria, sometimes to the countryside of Hungary. Wherever they went, she carried the sense of having reclaimed her life. In the evenings, as twilight deepened over Rusovcia, she would pause in the garden, listening to the rustle of leaves in the wind. The empire that had cast her out still stood, though it trembled, but here she was beyond its reach. She walked freely, without courtiers, without scrutiny, without whispers at her back. The palace windows of Vienna no longer defined her, and yet history never stops. As years passed, the world outside Rusovci grew more turbulent. Europe edged closer to catastrophe. In the distance, Sarajevo waited, its streets ready to echo with gunfire that would ignite a new war. The evening wind at Rusovci grew stronger, bending branches, carrying faintly the toll of bells from a city far away, as though warning of storms not yet seen. The bells tolled faintly in the distance. Their echoes carried on the wind to Rusovci, and with them came the shadow of war. It was the summer of 1914, and across Europe armies stirred, governments declared, alliances tightened into chains. The assassination in Sarajevo had struck a spark, and now the dry fields of rivalry and ambition caught fire. The First World War began, and with it, the old continent moved toward collapse. For Stephanie, the war was agony doubled. She was Belgian by birth, bound by memory and loyalty to the small kingdom where she had been born a princess. And in August 1914, Germany invaded Belgium, breaking its neutrality, overrunning its towns and villages. The world read of burning churches, of civilians shot, of refugees fleeing in endless lines along dusty roads. To be Belgian in that moment was to be marked by tragedy. Stephanie felt the weight of it in her very bones. Yet she was also bound to Hungary by marriage, and Hungary was part of the empire allied with Germany. In Budapest, in Vienna, victories were celebrated, newspapers carried boasts of progress, and the war was framed as duty and destiny. For Stephanie, the contradiction was unbearable. She mourned for Belgium, yet she lived among those who fought against it. She whispered her sorrow in private, but in public she remained silent. Her loyalties were questioned quietly. Her presence seemed uneasy to those around her. At Rusovce, she and Elimer retreated into seclusion. The estate lay far from battle lines, its fields untouched by shell or trench, but the war seeped in all the same. Prices rose, supplies dwindled, and grief touched every household. Neighbors whispered of sons lost in Galicia, of farms left untended, of hunger gnawing at their days. Even in her garden, Stephanie felt the war's reach. The sound of wind in the leaves seemed to carry not peace but lament. She turned her energy to charity, as many women of her rank did. She organized aid for the wounded, sent supplies to hospitals, comforted families displaced by fighting. These small acts gave her a sense of purpose, a way to ease her own helplessness, yet they carried their own unease. To aid Hungarians was to support the empire at war with her homeland. To refuse would be to turn her back on those who lived around her. There was no right path, only compromise, only quiet endurance. Meanwhile, her daughter Elizabeth Marie grew restless in Vienna. The young Archduchess, known already for her fiery temperament, began to chafe against the restrictions of court. She embraced ideas that scandalized the aristocracy, read works of socialism, moved in circles that shocked her elders. For Stephanie, who clung to tradition and dignity, her daughter's rebellion was both incomprehensible and painful. Letters between them grew strained. By the war's end, the bond would fray beyond repair. The years dragged on. By 1916, the empire was weary, its people thin, its armies exhausted. That year, the old emperor Franz Joseph died after nearly 7 decades on the throne. Vienna draped itself in black, and once more Stephanie and Elimer returned to the city that had shaped and scarred her life. She walked through its streets, older now, carrying the silence of memory. She stood in the cathedral as the emperor was laid to rest, the music solemn, the air heavy with incense. Soon after, she watched Charles and Zita crowned, their youth a brief flame of hope. For a moment, it seemed possible that Charles might bring peace. He spoke of ending the war, of reforming the empire, of granting more voice to its nations. Stephanie, watching from a distance, may have felt a flicker of sympathy. But the machinery of war was too strong, and the empire was already unraveling. By 1918, collapse came. Austria-Hungary fractured into nations. Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. Borders shifted, thrones crumbled, monarchs fled. The war ended with treaties that carved empires apart, leaving bitterness in their place. Millions were dead, cities broken, landscapes scarred. For Stephanie, the collapse was both end and beginning. The court that had rejected her no longer existed. The empire that had bound her was gone. Rusovce, once a Hungarian estate, now lay within the new borders of Czechoslovakia. And yet she and Elimer were spared exile. Unlike the Habsburgs forced to leave Austria, they were permitted to remain. Rusovce became their refuge, their continuity amid chaos. While dynasties scattered across Europe, they stayed in their gardens, their halls, their familiar rooms. For the first time in decades, Stephanie lived beyond the reach of court or crown. The silence that followed the war was deep. In Vienna, her daughter's rebellion grew louder, her politics sharper, her life a scandal whispered across Europe. In Brussels, her father's shadow grew darker, his Congo legacy condemned, his memory despised. In Hungary and Czechoslovakia, governments struggled to steady themselves, the people weary of promises. And in Rusovce, Stephanie walked at twilight. The fields were quiet again, the war's thunder distant now, though its scars lingered. She moved slowly, her hands clasped behind her back. her eyes upon the horizon. She was no longer crown princess, no longer dynastic pawn, no longer bound to palaces. She was simply Countess Lanier, mistress of a household, wife of a man she had chosen. But history never rests. Even in peace, unease lingered. New ideologies stirred, new tensions rose. The silence after war was fragile, a silence that would not last. The twilight deepened, the air cool upon her face, and in the distance a single light appeared. Faint, trembling, not a star but the flame of a lamp in a neighbor's house. It burned against the dark, steady but fragile, as though warning of another night approaching. The fragile lamp flickered against the vast darkness, a small circle of warmth surrounded by shadows. It burned steadily, but with each gust of wind its flame bent low, threatening to vanish. Such was Europe in the years after the First World War, a continent lit faintly by fragile hopes, but surrounded by storms that had not yet passed. For Stephanie, the war's end had brought both relief and exile of a different kind. She was no longer tied to an empire, no longer forced into the formalities of a court that had never loved her. The Habsburg dynasty had fallen, its palaces emptied, its titles stripped of power. For her, this collapse meant freedom, yet also a peculiar invisibility. She was neither central to the new order nor completely cast aside. At Rusovshi, she lived quietly with Elimer, apart from the noise of politics, in the rhythm of seasons and private contentment. The 1920s unfolded in a fragile peace. Stephanie filled her days with travel, with charity, with the company of those few who still sought her presence. She tended to her estate, supervised household affairs, walked among the gardens at dusk. For a time, it seemed she had found what she had long desired. A home not defined by dynasties, a love that endured, a space to live without scandal or duty. Yet sorrow remained close. Her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, now grown, became not solace but anguish. Elizabeth had inherited her father's restless temperament, but none of his restraint. She embraced socialism, shocking the remnants of Vienna's aristocracy. She moved in circles that defied tradition, took lovers openly, and challenged the very values that had once bound her mother's world. Newspapers christened her the Red Archduchess, a title both sensational and symbolic. For Stephanie, raised in discipline and shaped by duty, her daughter's rebellion was unbearable. They clashed bitterly, their conversations sharp with reproach. Elizabeth accused her mother of coldness, of clinging to old forms, of failing to understand the new world. Stephanie, in turn, saw in her daughter only recklessness and disgrace. The bond that had survived Rudolph's death, that had endured the strictures of court, now snapped in peacetime. In 1924, after a final quarrel, they severed ties completely. Mother and daughter did not speak again. The silence was total. Stephanie disinherited Elizabeth in her will. Elizabeth never sought reconciliation. Each carried her pride into old age, unbending. For Stephanie, the wound was deep, though she concealed it beneath composure. In private, she must have remembered the little girl she had once held, the child whose laughter had been her only joy in Vienna. Now that child was gone, replaced by a stranger whose choices she could not forgive. The estrangement was perhaps the greatest sorrow of her later years, a grief without end or closure. As the 1930s advanced, the world outside Rusovchi grew darker once more. The fragile lamp of peace bent low beneath gathering winds. Economic crisis swept across Europe, feeding unrest. Voices of extremism grew louder, banners unfurled in city squares, crowds moved in unison. Fascism rose in Italy, Nazism in Germany, authoritarianism in Hungary. Stephanie, now in her 70s, watched these changes with the weary recognition of one who had seen ambition turn to ruin before. She remembered her father, Leopold II, and his relentless pursuit of empire. She remembered Rudolph, consumed by disillusionment. She recognized in these movements the same fever, the same restless energy that promised greatness while sowing destruction. Newspapers carried images of parades, of salutes, of speeches that stirred masses. In them, she saw not renewal, but danger. In 1938, Austria was annexed by Germany in the Anschluss. Vienna, where she had once walked as a young bride, now cheered a dictator. The Hofburg Palace, once the stage of Habsburg ceremonies, now displayed swastikas. For Stephanie, reading from afar, it must have been a moment of strange bitterness. The empire that had cast her aside was gone, but the palaces that had once been hers to imagine now served another, their grandeur repurposed for tyranny. Hungary, where Rusovci lay, aligned itself uneasily with Germany. Nationalist voices sharpened, alliances hardened, suspicion grew. Conversations in drawing rooms turned cautious, glances guarded. Even within her household, Stephanie felt the air tighten. The estate, once her refuge, now lay within a continent preparing once again for war. Her health declined as the decade closed. She moved more slowly, her walks shorter, her steps measured. Elémère remained at her side, loyal as ever, but he too aged, his hair silvered, his strength less than before. Together they bore the passing years with quiet dignity, retreating further into seclusion. Yet the past never left her. Meyerling returned often in her thoughts, not as vivid pain, but as echo. She had ended her memoir at that moment, sealing her story in 1889, refusing to narrate what came after. Perhaps it was because, in her mind, her life had indeed ended there. Everything after merely survival. The world knew her as Rudolph's widow, the infected princess, the woman marked by scandal. She accepted this, even shaped it. What she did not speak of, the love of Elémère, the life at Rusovce, the estrangement of her daughter, remained in silence. As Europe edged closer to another conflict, silence became survival. Plans circulated to seize estates, to requisition Rusovci, to convert it into military use. She and Elémère withdrew further, living within narrower boundaries, their world shrinking, even as the world outside prepared for cataclysm. And when war came again in 1939, she bore it with the resignation of one who had already seen too much. She was 75 years old, and she had lived through revolutions, epidemics, betrayals, and the fall of empires. Now she would witness yet another descent into chaos. The fragile lamp in the neighbor's window burned lower, its flame bending under the wind. For a moment it seemed it might die, and yet against the dark it glowed still, trembling, refusing extinction. Beyond that small flame, another light flickered in memory. Not a lamp, but the glow of candles in the abbey of Pannonhalma, where monks walked in silence, where bells waited to toll, where her final refuge would be found. The glow of candlelight flickered faintly in the distance, illuminating narrow stone corridors, shadows stretching high upon vaulted arches. It was the light of Pannonhalma Arshabbey, where monks still walked in silence, their voices rising at dawn and dusk in chants that had not changed for centuries. And into this ancient refuge, in the final months of the Second World War, came Stephanie of Belgium, once crown princess of Austria-Hungary, now an old woman of 81, weary, yet unbroken. Rusovci, her beloved estate, had grown unsafe. Armies swept across Hungary, German forces retreating, the Soviet Red Army advancing with relentless momentum. Plans had been whispered of converting her estate into a field hospital. Soldiers requisitioned property. Officials made demands. Rumors of confiscation spread like fire. For Stephanie and Elémère, there was no safety left in the walls they had called home for decades. The abbey, sacred and enduring, seemed the only place where the storm might be weathered. The monks received them without ceremony, offering simple chambers, cool and spare. The air smelled faintly of wax and stone dust, the walls thick with the weight of centuries. For Stephanie, who had lived in palaces filled with gilt and marble, the austerity of the abbey must have felt strangely welcome. Here, stripped of grandeur, she found what she had long sought: quiet. Yet the war pressed even against these walls. The abbey itself stood in danger of requisition. Soldiers spoke of its potential as barracks, as hospital, as storehouse. The monks feared desecration, yet continued their chants. Stephanie, seated in the chapel, listened as voices rose around her. Latin words carried upward into arches, mingling with candle smoke, filling her with calm. In those moments, she was no longer widow or princess, but simply a soul among others, preparing to leave the burdens of her life behind. Her body was frail. Each step was slow, each breath thin. She leaned on Elimer's arm when she walked the cloister, her hand resting lightly on his sleeve. He, too, was aged, his hair silver, his movements careful, yet his devotion was unshaken. He had stood beside her for 45 years, through scandal, exile, estrangement, war. Now, in their final chapter, they endured together. In her chamber, Stephanie sat often by the window, looking out at the rolling hills. The land beyond was scarred by war. Villages burned, fields abandoned, soldiers moving across the horizon. Yet the hills themselves endured, green beneath the sun, patient in their silence. She watched them for hours, perhaps recalling the landscapes of her past, the gardens of Laeken, the avenues of Vienna, the coast of Miramare, the fields of Rusovsha. Each place, vivid once, now blurred into memory. Her thoughts wandered endlessly. She remembered her childhood brother, lost too soon, her father's cold commands, her mother's absence, her sister's laughter. She remembered her wedding day, the grandeur of Vienna, the vows spoken beside Rudolph. She remembered the night at Mayerling, the silence of death, the coffin of her husband, the shadow that never lifted. She remembered the rain at Potocki's grave, the moment she chose Elimer in defiance, the exile that followed. She remembered the estrangement from her daughter, the silence that never healed. These memories, sharp once, now softened at their edges. In her last months, they were no longer wounds, but shapes, drifting through her mind like figures passing through fog. She carried them gently, no longer resisting, no longer resenting. They were simply hers. Outside the abbey, the war reached its climax. The Soviets advanced, Budapest fell, Germany reeled toward defeat. News came in fragments, whispered in corridors, carried by travelers who sought shelter. The monks prayed for peace, even as soldiers prowled the countryside. Yet within the abbey walls, time seemed suspended. The chants rose at dawn, the bells tolled at dusk, the rhythm of centuries continued. And then, on the morning of the 23rd of August, 1945, Stephanie's long journey ended. She died quietly in her chamber, her hand resting in Elimer's, her eyes closed, her breath ceasing like the soft extinguishing of a candle flame. She had lived through 8 decades, through the rise and fall of empires, through scandal, betrayal, exile, war. She had been daughter, wife, widow, mother, countess, exile, survivor. Now she was simply still. The monks carried her coffin into the crypt, where stone arches rose above and candles flickered along narrow aisles. Their voices rose in chant, solemn and steady, echoing against the walls. The abbey had buried kings and peasants, nobles and monks alike. Now it received Stephanie, placing her among the long company of the forgotten. A year later, Elimer was laid beside her, their names carved together on stone. The war did not pause for her passing. Europe moved forward, borders redrawn, nations occupied, new regimes rising. Rusovsha was taken, its halls seized, its gardens no longer hers. Her daughter lived on, still estranged, never reconciled, never softened. For the world, Stephanie's death was a footnote, her story already faded, remembered only through the tragedy of Mayerling. Yet within the abbey, her name remained on stone, her body at rest, her memory woven into the chants that continued each day. Each time the bells tolled, they carried her story faintly, though no one outside listened. The candle in the crypt trembled, wax pooling slowly at its base. One flame bent low, quivered, and fell into darkness. The wick smoked faintly, its light gone, but other flames burned still, their glow steady in the silence. And in that silence another image formed, not the crypt, not the abbey, but a book left open upon a desk. Its final page blank, the ink never written, the story unfinished.